She was lost in the woods. What this dog did changed everything. Sometimes the forest doesn't echo with danger. Sometimes it listens. And sometimes something finds you when no one else remembers you're missing. Years ago, a little girl named Lila disappeared without a trace. The town thought it was too late. The woods had taken her. But something else had found her first. A shadow with fur. Eyes that had seen too much. A heart that refused to leave. His name was Blitz. This is not just a story about rescue. It's a story about staying. About what it means for a dog to become a soul's compass. And how one child's whisper could carry through years into a new beginning. By the time you reach the final bark, you'll understand. Some dogs don't just guard lives, they guard legacies. The wind carried a chill that morning dry, restless, and whispering through the skeletal remains of Oakmere's condemned warehouse district. Rusted signs hung like forgotten memories on chain-link fences, and the brittle grass along the sidewalks lay beaten by the weight of a long-forgotten winter. Officer Mason Grant walked with the familiar rhythm of routine, his boots tapping gently against the cracked pavement. At his side was Blitzlower now, with silver gathering around his muzzle and a limp in his rear right leg that came and went like an old ghost. Retired or not, Blitz never let Mason leave for patrol without him. He didn't bark to protest. He simply sat by the door each morning, leash in his mouth, waiting eyes calm, steady, and quietly insistent. Mason had stopped trying to argue months ago. They had walked this perimeter hundreds of times, but this morning felt different. The cold wasn't biting. It crept. The air didn't just stinge, it listened. Blitz paused at the edge of a warped sidewalk slab and sniffed the air. His ears pricked, tail low, shoulders tense. Mason's hand instinctively brushed his holster. Blitz didn't alert often anymore, not since retirement, but when he did, Mason listened. "Something there, buddy," Mason murmured. Blitz didn't answer, of course. He simply veered sharply toward the rust-stained alley beside a warehouse, long since condemned Unit 7B, if Mason remembered right. He hesitated for a moment, then followed, boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. The lot was deserted, mostly. A collapsed fence leaned in like a drunk against a pole, and a pile of rotted pallets lay abandoned in a far corner. It smelled of mold and rust. Blitz moved deliberately, nose to ground, as though following a trail no human eyes could see. Then he stopped. Mason's breath caught as Blitz froze in place, rigid, alert, gaze locked on a narrow break between two rusting dumpsters. "Blitz," Mason whispered, stepping closer. "Talk to me." The German shepherd's ears flicked forward. No growl, no bark, just silence. A heavy, telling stillness. Mason stepped beside him, narrowed his eyes, and looked through the gap. That's when he saw it. A small hand, curled, bare, dirt-smudged fingers pressed against concrete. His heart thudded once, then again, harder. Mason stepped forward carefully, crouched, and peered around the edge of the dumpster. There, tucked into the alcove formed by the rusted wall and a stack of broken pallets, was a child. A girl, no older than 7. She didn't flinch when he approached. She didn't scream. She just sat there, arms wrapped tight around her knees, chin buried low, eyes swollen and red from crying so long they'd dried themselves raw. She was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. One shoe was missing. Her lip was split. "Hey," Mason said gently, crouching to her level. "Hey there, sweetheart, it's okay. I'm a police officer." Blitz stepped beside him, lowering his body slowly, belly to the ground. The dog didn't move closer. He just lay there quiet, calm, watching her with the same patience he'd once used with traumatized children at crime scenes. The girl's eyes finally moved from Mason's face to Blitz's. There was something in that gaze Mason would never forget. Not panic, not confusion, but recognition. Not of Mason, of Blitz. As if she already knew him. Her lower lip quivered, then her small voice cracked through the air like broken glass. "Doggy," she whispered. Blitz inched forward, paws silent over gravel. Mason didn't stop him. "Yeah," Mason said softly. "That's Blitz. He's a good boy. He found you." Tears welled up again in the girl's eyes, and before Mason could react, she reached forward and buried her fingers in the thick fur around Blitz's neck. She didn't sob. She didn't speak. She just held on. Mason exhaled slowly, voice low. It's okay now. You're safe. But something still wasn't right. The girl was too calm, her face too blank. She hadn't asked for her parents, hadn't even said her name. Blitz shifted slightly, pressing closer to her with a protective instinct that stirred something deep in Mason's chest. Sweetheart, he said gently, can you tell me your name? No answer, only silence, and the sound of Blitz's slow, rhythmic breathing beside her. Mason reached for his radio, but before he could speak, Blitz's ears flicked again. The shepherd turned his head not toward the girl, but toward the edge of the alley. The hairs on Mason's neck bristled. Someone had been watching them. Blitz came to a halt near a rusted-out dumpster, its metal sides eaten away by time and salt. He didn't growl, didn't sniff in the usual curious circles. He stood frozen, ears forward, tail stiff but not hostile, just alert. Mason felt the tension before he heard the sound. It was barely audible, a stifled hiccup, wet, fragile, like wind passing through a hollow reed. Mason took a slow step forward. The gravel shifted under his boots with a crunch that felt too loud for the silence that had settled over the alleyway. Blitz? He murmured. The dog didn't move, but his body lowered into a cautious crouch, eyes locked on the shadows tucked between the dumpster and the crumbling brick wall beside it. There was something there, something small, something breathing. And then Mason heard it clearly this time, a child's whimper, shallow and trembling, like the sound of someone trying not to be heard but needing to be found. He knelt. It's okay, he said quietly, as if speaking too loud might shatter the fragile stillness between them. You're safe now. I'm Officer Grant, and this is Blitz. Blitz didn't look back. He simply began to crawl forward on his elbows, his movements as slow and soft as mist. No barking, no growling, just the faint swish of his fur brushing the gravel, tail gently wagging not excitedly, but rhythmically, like a metronome keeping time with something ancient in the air. Mason squinted toward the gap between cardboard and broken crates. Something shifted, and then he saw her, a little girl, no older than 7, tucked beneath layers of stained fabric and packing foam, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, her eyes too wide for a child that smollicked onto Blitz. Not in fear, in disbelief. Her lips quivered, but she said nothing, just clutched a faded pink backpack to her chest. The kind with a missing zipper and a cartoon rabbit barely visible beneath smears of mud. Blitz stopped just a foot away. He laid his head flat against the ground, brown eyes blinking slowly, tail still wagging in that steady, calming beat. The girl stopped crying. Mason didn't move yet. He'd seen enough in his years to know that sudden gestures, even kindness, could feel like violence to a child who'd learned to expect the worst. So he waited, let the quiet do the speaking. The wind picked up, rustling loose bits of plastic across the alley like forgotten memories. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't run. She just watched Blitz. A moment passed. Then another. Blitz gave a small sigh. The kind dogs give when they're not bored, but patient. That was when the girl shifted. She extended one small hand covered in grime, knuckles scraped Rowand, laid it gently on Blitz's muzzle. Not to pet, just to touch, to see if he was real. Mason exhaled, almost without realizing he'd been holding his breath. He crouched lower, voice still low and even. He's your friend now, he said, and so am I. The girl blinked slowly, as if parsing those words through layers of exhaustion and distrust. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. Mason moved closer, careful to keep his steps quiet, non-threatening. He knelt beside Blitz now, eyes level with hers. Are you hurt? He asked gently. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly. Are you cold? A pause. Then the smallest nod. Mason slipped off his patrol jacket, holding it out toward her without getting too close. She didn't reach for it, but her eyes followed the fabric. I'll leave it here, he said, placing it slowly on the ground, halfway between them. And it smells like old coffee and dog fur. Blitz gave a soft chuff at the word dog. A whisper of something passed through the child's face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it wasn't fear anymore either. Mason glanced down, noticed the bruises along her wrists, the way her shoes didn't match. The backpack had no name tag. This child hadn't been lost. She had been left. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the backpack's strap. Then, so soft, he almost missed it. "Lena," Mason repeated it quietly, like a vow. "Hi, Lena." Blitz licked her wrist once, gentle as a breath. She didn't recoil. It was enough. Mason reached for his radio, pressing it to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Officer Grant. I have a child female, approximately 7 years old, located behind a dumpster on Elm and 7th. Appears unharmed, but needs medical evaluation. Requesting immediate assistance." The radio crackled, then confirmed. Mason looked back at Lena. "Help's on the way, okay? Just people who make sure you're safe and warm." She didn't speak, but she laid her head against Blitz's side, her small body curving instinctively toward warmth. The dog didn't move, just allowed it. Like he'd been waiting for this moment, like he'd been carrying the ache of her sorrow all morning without knowing it. Above them, the clouds parted slightly, letting through a shaft of cold light. It landed across Blitz's graying fur, and the girl's tangled hair, and the empty alley that had been too quiet for too long. Mason stood watch, silent. The wind carried no more cries now. Only breathing. Only peace. The gravel crunched beneath Mason's boots as he slowly crouched beside the broken crates, keeping his hands where the child could see them. Blitz stayed a few feet ahead, lying still, his body low and relaxed, head resting gently on his paws. His eyes didn't blink much, just watched the little girl with the kind of knowing silence only a dog like him possessed. She had stopped crying, but her breathing was sharp, uneven. There was dirt smudged across her cheeks, streaked through with faint lines where the tears had carved down. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest. The backpack she clutched looked as though it had been dropped in the mud too many times. A small patch sewn near the zipper had nearly peeled off, a faded yellow star. Mason set the water bottle down between them and slid it an inch forward. "It's okay," he said softly, voice barely more than a whisper. "You're safe now." The wind rolled over the lot again, colder this time, sending a ripple through the cardboard that sheltered her. Her fingers, small and shaking, edged forward. She grabbed the bottle and held it like a precious thing, unscrewing the cap with effort. When she drank, it was in small, panicked sips like someone used to going without. Mason waited. Blitz moved first. He inched closer, one slow paw at a time, his breathing calm and deep. He stopped just near her knee, then lay still again. No barking, no demands, just a gentle tail thump against the gravel. The girl reached out with tentative fingers and touched his fur first one stroke, then another. Mason saw something shift in her face. Her shoulders uncoiled just a little. "His name's Blitz," Mason said quietly. "He used to be a police dog." The girl didn't look at him yet. Her fingers were still buried in Blitz's fur. A pause. A breath. "My name's Mason," he offered, letting the silence stretch. She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were too old for 7. They had that glassy, far-off stare, the kind Mason had seen too many times, in too many victims, the kind that only came from seeing things you never should have. He softened his voice even more. "What's yours?" She blinked. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, "Lila." Mason nodded slowly, committing it to memory the way one memorizes a prayer. "Hi, Lila. It's real nice to meet you." She hugged the backpack tighter. Her gaze flicked toward the alley. Mason followed it instinctively, but there was only wind and shadows now. I ran," she murmured. "Okay, that's okay. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." "How?" She hesitated, then looked at him again, this time with more urgency than fear. "I ran from the black truck." The words weren't loud, but they were sharp, like broken glass. Mason felt something twist in his chest. He didn't let it show. He kept his posture calm. No sudden movements, no questions yet. But something about the way she said it, the black truck, had weight. Not just fear, memory, trauma. "You did the right thing," he said gently. "You're safe now. Blitz and I are going to make sure of it." Lila didn't respond, but her small fingers reached up toward Blitz's collar, feeling for something. Mason saw it a quiet, instinctive motion, like she was looking for proof that this wasn't a dream. She found Blitz's tag. Her thumb rubbed over the engraved metal again and again. Blitz didn't move. He just let her hold it. Something passed between them, quiet as breath, steady as trust. Mason had seen Blitz interact with hundreds of people over the years. He knew the difference between tolerance and connection. This was something else. "You want to get out of the cold?" Mason asked softly. Lila hesitated, then nodded. "I got a warm truck. Blitz rides in front. I can put the heater on high." She nodded again, slower this time. Her knees unfolded gradually. As she crawled out from the crates, Mason saw how thin she was. Her jeans were torn near the cuffs. Her coat didn't fit quite right, maybe a hand-me-down. But it wasn't the clothes that stuck with him. It was the way she moved. Careful, always glancing over her shoulder. Like she'd learned somewhere that the world didn't forgive girls who ran. Blitz stayed by her side the entire time. Mason noticed how she didn't look at him for permission. She looked at Blitz, as if he were the one she trusted. As they neared the truck, Mason opened the passenger door and spread out an old fleece blanket over the seat. "You hungry?" he asked. She shrugged. "I got crackers in the glove box. They're a little smushed." He offered her the packet, and she took it without a word, curling into the seat as Blitz hopped up beside her, settling with a heavy sigh. His body leaned ever so slightly into hers. Not enough to trap her, just enough to say, "I'm here." Mason watched her in the rearview mirror for a long moment. Lila broke the silence again. "Are you going to take me back?" Mason looked at her, eyebrows furrowed. "Back where?" She shook her head. "I don't want to go back. I can't." He didn't push. "Then we won't," he said. "Not until you're ready to talk, and even then only if it's safe." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. Outside, the wind howled past rusted metal and crumbling brick, but inside the truck there was warmth and a stillness. Mason glanced down. Blitz had shifted slightly, resting his muzzle across Lila's knee. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak, but she laid her small hand on his head. And for the first time in that long gray morning, she closed her eyes. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed overhead, too bright, too sterile, too sharp for a little girl whose world had recently turned to shadows. Lila sat hunched in a corner of the quiet observation room, her tiny frame dwarfed by the oversized fleece blanket draped over her shoulders. Her hair was matted, her fingers clenched tight around the frayed straps of her backpack like it was the last thread tethering her to something she could still call her own. Across from her, a detective leaned forward, gentle voice softening with every failed attempt. "What's your last name, sweetie? Can you tell us where home is?" No answer. Lila didn't even look up. Behind the one-way glass, Mason stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight. He had been through enough scenes like this to know when a child was lost and when they were hiding. Not from someone, from something. And whatever that something was, it had stolen the words right out of her mouth. "She hasn't spoken to anyone?" he asked. The precinct psychologist, Dr. Lena Marks, nodded, her eyes tired. "Not a word. No signs of physical abuse, just fatigue, dehydration. But psychologically, she's gone inward. Classic trauma response. Could be acute stress, could be longer term." Mason's eyes stayed fixed on the girl. "What about her pack? Contents are minimal. A few mismatched clothes, some granola bars, one empty water bottle, and this." She held up a crumpled, photo-faded and worn, a younger Lila, maybe 5, smiling beside a woman whose face had been partially torn away by time or intent. Possibly her mother. M? Mason took the photo without a word, his thumb brushing over the image like it might breathe if touched gently enough. Then he glanced toward the door. She talked to Blitz. Dr. Marks raised a brow. "The dog?" She let him get close. First touch she allowed. No flinching. There was a pause between them. "Sometimes animals break through where people can't," the doctor said quietly. "They don't ask questions. They just exist. That can feel safer for a child in her state." "Oh?" Mason nodded once, then pushed through the door and walked into the room where Lila sat. Blitz trailed silently behind him, paws soft against the floor. The moment Lila saw the dog, her shoulders loosened, not all the way, but enough to notice. Blitz padded over and settled on the floor beside her without a sound. He didn't nudge, didn't paw, just laid his head gently against the side of her leg. Lila blinked slowly. Then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers moved reaching for the metal tag on Blitz's collar. It clinked softly as she turned it in her hands. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Mason crouched a few feet away, careful not to disturb the quiet that had been so hard-won. "You can stay with him as long as you like," he said gently. "He's got a good heart, that one. Saved more lives than most people I know." Still, she didn't speak. But this time, her eyes met his. Just for a second, it was enough. Later that afternoon, in the break room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paperwork, Mason sat across from Captain Yates. "You need to call CPS," Yates said, voice firm but not unkind. "Protocol's clear. You're not equipped to take care of a kid overnight, Mason. She doesn't trust anyone. Won't eat unless Blitz is in the room. She's a child. She needs a bed, a clean change of clothes, a stable environment." Mason shook his head. "She doesn't need systems right now. She needs to not be afraid." Yates leaned back in his chair, sighing through his nose. "You thinking of taking her home?" "Just until we find out more. A night or two." There was a long silence. Then Yates said quietly, "You sure you're up for that? You and Blitz? It's been a long time since." Mason's gaze hardened, not defensive, but wounded. "Yeah," he said. "It has. Hey." That night, while the city exhaled beneath a cloudy dusk, Mason pulled into his gravel driveway. His house was quiet, a little too tidy-like, a place that had stopped being lived in and started being preserved. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Lila sat curled in the back seat, Blitz's head resting on her knee. She hadn't spoken a single word since the precinct. But she hadn't cried either. That had to mean something. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar wood and old coffee. Mason laid a blanket on the couch and turned on the fireplace, not for heat, but for the sound. Something soft. Something alive. He handed her a mug of warm broth. She took it in both hands and sipped slowly, eyes following Blitz as he paced the perimeter of the living room before settling near her feet. Mason watched them both. He didn't ask anything. Not yet. Instead, he sat across the room and let the silence do the talking. When he finally rose to head upstairs, he hesitated. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said. "If you need anything tonight, just call for me, or Blitz." She didn't answer, but as he turned to leave, her voice stopped him, barely above a whisper. "Is he yours?" Mason turned, surprised. "Blitz?" He smiled gently. "No, kid, I'm his." There was a flicker at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but not sorrow either. Then she lowered her head and whispered something to the dog, something too soft to hear. And, for the first time that day, Blitz's tail wagged once. Just once. As if he understood everything that didn't need to be said. The precinct was quieter than usual that evening. The clatter of keyboards, the low hum of dispatch radios, and the occasional murmur of officers faded into the background as Mason stood beside the glass observation window. Inside, Lila sat curled up on the small couch in the break room, knees hugged tightly to her chest, eyes trained on the blank paper in front of her. Her small fingers clutched a dull crayon Mason had found in a supply drawer next to a stack of outdated coloring books. Blitz lay on the floor just a few feet away, chin resting on his paws, his gaze never leaving her. They hadn't gotten much from her since they brought her in. Not a name, not a single detail until now. She hadn't spoken since they offered her a sandwich and a blanket, and even then, her eyes darted toward the door with a flinch every time someone new walked by. But something about Blitz had shifted things. She hadn't asked for him, hadn't even reached out. She'd simply laid down next to him, and after several minutes, picked up the crayon and started to draw. It wasn't much at first. A few unsteady lines, circles that didn't quite meet. But Mason recognized something in the slow, deliberate way her hand moved. This wasn't play. This was memory. Dr. Emily Tran, the precinct's trauma specialist, stood beside Mason. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "She's disassociating. But the act of drawing it might be her way of reconnecting. Just let her go at her own pace." Mason nodded, though his jaw tightened as he watched. Inside, Lila shifted. Her hand paused, hovered, then moved again. Slowly, a house took shape rectangular, lopsided, with windows that had thick black vertical lines drawn across them. Bars. They weren't windows, they were cells. She added a tree in the corner, but it looked wrong-twisted, leafless, roots like claws. Then came a man. His head was too big for his body. His hands, disproportionately large, were shaded incompletely. Black gloves. Lila's fingers trembled as she pressed harder, darker strokes smearing the paper. Her breath caught in her throat. Blitz let out a small, quiet whine, not a warning, but a note of concern. Lila looked at him, then slowly reached for another crayon. This time, blue. She drew a dog. Its ears stood up, tail curled slightly, strong shoulders like Blitz's, and the eyes just two ovals, really. But she paused before coloring them in, then gently shaded them with brown. She placed the crayon down. Her voice was so soft, Mason almost missed it. "My dog is gone." Mason entered slowly. He crouched down to her level but didn't sit too close. "What was your dog's name?" he asked gently. Lila looked at Blitz. Her mouth opened, closed. She didn't answer. Her fingers pressed the edge of the paper. "I bet he was brave," Mason said, watching her closely. She nodded once. He waited a beat longer before speaking again. "Is this the house where you were staying?" Another nod. "With the man in the black gloves?" She blinked slow, as if memory and fear were two rivers crossing in her mind. Mason reached into his shirt pocket, took out a wrapped candy. "I used to do this with kids back when I worked community outreach. One question, one candy. Only if you want." He placed it on the table and waited. After a moment, Lila's small hand reached out. She took the candy and unwrapped it quietly. "Doctor," Tran observed from the doorway. Her arms crossed gently, giving them space. Mason continued. "Do you know where that house is?" Lila bit her lower lip. Her hand reached up to scratch her wrist. That's when he saw it. A faint mark barely there under the grime and bruising like a smudge of faded ink. "Lila," he said softly, "can I see your wrist?" She hesitated, then turned it slightly. Mason leaned closer, trying not to alarm her. It was a tattoo, faint. Just a few numbers, no more than 5 digits burned into the underside of her wrist. The kind of crude inking you didn't get in a licensed parlor. The kind they used in rings that didn't think of children as children at all. Something in Mason's stomach dropped. Not just fear, rage. He stood and walked toward the hallway. Tran followed. "That's not a normal tattoo," he said, his voice tight. Tran's expression was grim. "Number, it's an identifier. For trafficking." She nodded, and the way she avoids adults, avoids doorways, flinches at sudden sounds, this child's been through something long-term, sustained. Mason ran a hand through his hair. "She said she ran from a black truck. And now this. We've got a dog missing, a child with a mark, and a drawing that looks more like a prison." He turned to look through the glass again. Blitz was now sitting upright beside her, tail tapping slowly. Lila had tucked the paper into her backpack. It was the only thing she clutched tighter than the old, worn-out stuffed toy they found in her pocket. "What if she didn't just run away?" Mason said. "What if she escaped?" Tran didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "Then we need to find out where she came from. Fast." Mason nodded, but something deeper stirred in his chest, not just duty. Not just the ache of another lost child in the system. It was the way Blitz had laid beside her like he'd known her sorrow. The way Lila had drawn a dog with the same eyes. The way she'd whispered, "My dog is gone like morning," wasn't new to her. There were pieces missing, but one thing was clear. Whatever had happened to Lila hadn't ended. It was still out there, and it was watching. The fluorescent lights in the precinct's evidence room flickered with a tired hum. Morning had long since bled into afternoon, but for Officer Mason Grant, time had begun to feel like a slow, tightening loop. He stood by the observation window, coffee untouched in his hand, his eyes drifting between the child in the adjacent room and the dog that refused to leave her feet. Blitz lay curled at the base of the chair where Lila sat, his head resting gently across her sneakers. She hadn't spoken again, not since her whispered confession about the black gloves, but her hand stayed on Blitz's collar, small fingers tracing the metal tag with the kind of reverence reserved for something once lost and now found. Then came the squeak of rubber wheels. Down the hall, An officer rolled in a gray crate, marked Lost and Found, case 27,894. The lid was half open, revealing a tangle of objects sealed in evidence: bags, discarded toys, a tattered shoe, a baby blanket stained with something darker than juice. The remnants of childhood, stripped of warmth and context, now sorted and cataloged. Found these near the warehouse district last week. Might be junk, might not, the officer muttered, setting the crate beside Mason with the apathy of routine. Mason gave a nod, only half listening, but Blitz lifted his head. It started with a low sound. Not a bark, not even a growl. Just a quiet, vibrating rumble from deep in his chest. Mason stiffened. Blitz stood, tail low, ears back, not in fear, but in something older, something instinctive. His body leaned forward, nose twitching toward the box. "What is it, buddy?" Mason asked softly. Blitz took 2 steps and stopped in front of the crate. He didn't sniff like a curious dog. He stared, frozen as if something inside was wrong. Then, slowly, with the caution of a soldier approaching a landmine, he lowered his head and growled. This time, deep, steady, unmistakable. "Blitz." Mason knelt beside him, placing a hand on the thick fur of his neck. The dog's gaze didn't waver. Mason reached forward and pulled one of the smaller bags to the top. A child's sock, pink, with a fading unicorn print, frayed at the heel. Blitz whined. In the room behind the glass, Lila's head shot up. Before Mason could react, she was on her feet. She pressed her hands against the glass with a sudden urgency, her breath fogging up the surface as she pointed, wide-eyed, toward the box. Mason unlocked the door, stepping aside as Lila rushed out, ignoring the startled voices behind her. She ran straight to the crate. Her fingers scrambled through the plastic bags until she found Ada's small rubber keychain, shaped like a firefly. Its wings were broken. The paint chipped. She clutched it to her chest like it held her heartbeat. "My dog had this," she whispered, barely audible. "I gave it to him when they took me away." Mason crouched to her level. "The same dog with eyes like Blitz?" Lila nodded, tears beginning to spill, but her voice remained steady. "They hurt him because he growled at the man with the gloves. He tried to protect me." Blitz sat beside her now, his presence anchoring her like an old, silent guardian. Mason glanced between the girl, the evidence bag, and the old dog whose reaction had cut through the fog like a blade. This wasn't coincidence. He picked up the sock again. It was small, too small for Lila, unless it had been hers before. Or maybe someone else's. "Did this belong to another kid?" he asked gently. Lila looked down. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "There were others." Mason swallowed hard. He stood, motioning for the psychologist nearby. "Keep her here. I'll be back." Before leaving, he looked at Blitz. "You found something, didn't you, old man?" Blitz didn't move. He just watched him with eyes that had seen too much and remembered it all. In the interrogation room, the crate sat under brighter light now. Mason and Detective Herrera examined each item, matching timelines, coordinates, and recent arrests. The keychain had been found near a trailer on the south edge of the lot, the same area where Lila had been discovered. Herrera furrowed her brow. "You're thinking the dog in her drawing wasn't imaginary?" "I think he was real," Mason replied. "And I think Blitz knows him." You believe they train dogs to guard the kids? Or to keep them silent?" Mason murmured. Blitz didn't bark. He approached her like he remembered something. Herrera looked skeptical but didn't argue. "I'll push for access to the sealed case files connected to that trailer bust. If there's a pattern, we'll find it." Mason nodded. But even as she walked out, his eyes were on Blitz, who had resumed his post beside the child. He'd seen that look before on the streets, in alleyways, during raids when Blitz would freeze, not from fear, but from memory, from scent, from knowing something deeper was unfolding. And Blitz had just opened the first door. The precinct felt quieter than usual, not by volume, but by weight, like the walls themselves were listening. Mason sat alone in the narrow cubicle tucked in the corner of records, the blue light from his monitor tracing tired shadows beneath his eyes. Blitz lay curled at his feet, head resting on crossed paws, ears twitching at every passing footfall. It was the 3rd hour Mason had been combing through the state's missing children database. Still no Lila. He'd searched by age range, by eye color, by vague resemblance, expanded the radius to 4 neighboring counties, even scanned archived Amber Alerts and unconfirmed sightings over the past year. Nothing. No match. No trace. Mason leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, rubbing his temples. "She's not just unreported," he muttered, half to himself, half to Blitz. "It's like she was erased." Blitz didn't move, but his eyes opened watching Mason with that silent intuition dogs always seem to carry, especially the ones who'd seen things. Mason clicked into the CPS portal again. Officer login. Restricted access. He scrolled down a list of intake reports from the past 3 months, focusing on entries marked pending investigation. There were gaps. Subtle, almost surgical entire cases with assigned ID numbers had disappeared from the chain, not marked as resolved, not closed, just gone. No audit trail, no supervisor notes, no digital fingerprints. He pulled up the last batch of PDF exports from the server, the ones that clerks usually backed up in case the system went down. Case number 4278, unlisted. Case number 4280, missing. Case number 4283, corrupted file. 3 in a row, all within the past 2 weeks. His cursor hovered. A knot formed low in his stomach. He reached for the precinct landline, dialing internal IT. "Yeah, tech desk," a voice answered through light static. "This is Officer Mason Grant, badge 2627, he said, keeping his voice level. "Have there been any system outages or server migrations in the last month that could have caused missing CPS files?" A pause. "Not that I know of. All the cloud backups were verified during last week's audit." "Why?" "Some files are gone. Missing. Not even showing up in the logs." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll have to escalate that," the voice said more carefully. "Want me to open a case number?" Mason considered. Then, "Number not yet, thanks." He hung up and sat motionless for a while, listening to the slow hum of the overhead lights. Blitz raised his head slightly. Mason's knee was bouncing. He hadn't noticed. A soft knock tapped on the glass beside his desk. It was Angela Ramasocial Services, liaison, sharp-eyed and kind in a weary sort of way. She nodded toward the door. "You might want to see this," she said. "It's about the girl." Mason followed her into the conference room, where Lila sat quietly by the window, drawing again. Blitz had been with her earlier, but now was back at Mason's side, restless. Angela closed the door behind them and lowered her voice. "I called in a friend at the DOJ, off the record. Asked her to scan Lila's photo through federal case files missing minors, trafficking suspicions, even witness protection overlaps. And nothing," she said. "But when I asked about foster intake anomalies, she found something strange. 6 case files flagged in the system, all from this region, all marked as unsubstantiated neglect. That's the tag they use when someone makes a report, but it's dropped due to lack of evidence." Mason frowned. "And?" "They all share the same intake officer," Angela said. "But that officer no longer exists in the system." His jaw tightened. "A ghost employee," Angela nodded. "And 2 of those reports were from the same street where we found Lila." Just then, a low growl rumbled from Blitz. Mason turned. Blitz was on his feet now, hackles stiff. He stood by the narrow window slit, eyes locked on the street below. A black SUV idled at the curb across the street, engine purring like a cat in ambush. Windows tinted too dark for city regulation. Mason stepped beside Blitz, watching. The SUV didn't move, but neither did Blitz. He stood rooted, like a statue trained by years of service to detect what instinct alone couldn't explain. His ears were up, tail low, body still but not afraid, alert. "You recognize that car?" Mason asked quietly. Blitz didn't look at him, just stared. Then a blink, a subtle shift of weight. He stepped back and pressed his body gently against Mason's leg. "Got it," Mason murmured. "We're being watched." The SUV pulled off a moment later, turning smoothly at the end of the block. Too smoothly. Mason exchanged a glance with Angela. "This isn't just a child case," she said softly. "Someone doesn't want her found." He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the street. Blitz was still watching too, long after the vehicle disappeared. They both knew the same thing. Something darker was uncoiling beneath the surface, and the girl wasn't lost. She was escaping. The wind along Dockside Avenue carried a bitter taste of rust and seawater, rolling over the forgotten warehouses like a sigh from the bones of the city. Mason stood at the mouth of the alley, hand resting on Blitz's back, eyes scanning the concrete that still bore the ghosts of last week. It hadn't rained since that night. The ground was dry, now coated in a dusty sheen of gravel, tires, soot, and something faintly chemical. Blitz sniffed the air once, ears twitching. Then he moved. Not with urgency, but intent. Mason followed close as Blitz led them to the rusted dumpster again, the same one where they'd found Lila. It sat unchanged, but the air around it felt charged like the aftershock of a scream no one heard. Blitz paused beside a smear of oil on the asphalt, nose pressed low. Then his paw stepped deliberately over it, and Mason noticed the faint indentations in the gravella-looping arc of tread marks, sharp and recent. He crouched, brushing his fingers along the edge of the impression. "Not the same tires as before," he muttered. "Too wide, reinforced." "A surveillance van?" Blitz gave a low rumble from his throat, eyes narrowing toward the shadows by the loading dock. They moved together. Near the base of the metal roll-up door, something small gleamed beneath a discarded tarp. Mason bent down, lifted the edge carefully, and found a syringe, still half-filled, cap off, stamped with a hospital inventory sticker that had been torn halfway. Blitz didn't growl, but his hackles stood up. Mason wrapped the vial in a tissue, slipping it into an evidence pouch. "Someone was here," he said under his breath, "and they wanted someone out cold." The door groaned softly in the wind. Closed, padlocked, but the ground told a different story. Tiny scrapes on the metal threshold, a smear just faint off blood or paint at knee level. Blitz barked once, short, alert, then looked to the left wall where a security camera should have been perched. Gone. Just wires, frayed ends, freshly clipped. Mason's pulse ticked up. He scanned the rest of the area, at least 3 camera mounts that had been similarly severed. It wasn't just vandalism, it was erasure. Someone had intentionally wiped the watchful eyes from this alley. "Okay," he whispered, straightening. "So, someone cleaned house, but not perfectly." He took a photo of the tread marks, then another of the vial placement, sending them directly to his encrypted line. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a card creased at the edges from use. It was time to call Jack. Jack Ortega hadn't been on the force in years, but he still had the sharpest fingers in digital forensics this side of the state, officially retired. Unofficially, Mason's off-the-books lifeline when cases went deeper than what the system was built to stomach. Mason hit call. 3 rings. Then a sleepy voice. "Tell me you didn't find another dead-end server in a strip mall again." "I wish," Mason said. "It's worse. Surveillance cut. Warehouse visit. Found a sedative vial. Same place we pulled Lila." There was a pause. "You think someone's running ops out of there?" "I think they cleaned it too neatly. No traffic cams on the street. Public feeds blank. That's not coincidence." "You want me to dig?" "Deep. Look for camera feeds, redirected off-site. Anything scrubbed in the last 72 hours around Dockside." "You got it," Jack said. "But be careful. If someone's wiping city records, they've got clearance, or someone who owes them." The line clicked dead. Mason pocketed his phone, exhaled. Blitz was still by the wall, nose pressed to a crack in the brickwork. Then he sat, watching. Still. The kind of stillness that wasn't empty but focused. Waiting for something. Listening for something beyond human range. Mason walked over, knelt beside him. "You remember something, don't you?" he asked quietly. Blitz didn't move, but his ear twitched slightly. Then he looked at Mason, that look again intense, unwavering, old as trust. Mason had seen it on battlefields, at disaster sites, in the eyes of dogs who'd survived too much and still chose to believe. Something passed between them, not words, but direction. "All right," Mason murmured. "We follow this, no matter how deep it goes." He turned one last time to the alley took in the dumpster, the tire marks, the camera wires like veins torn open. This place wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a handoff point. Someone had brought Lila here. Someone else came for the cleanup. And whatever operation this was, it had protocol and a pattern. Mason knew one thing. When protocol begins to slip, so do secrets. He opened the squad car door for Blitz. The German Shepherd jumped in without a sound, but didn't sit. He kept his gaze out the window, toward the alley fading in the rearview mirror. Mason drove slowly, quietly, every turn deliberate. Back at the precinct, he'd start building a map. Tread patterns, missing records, Lila's drawing, the keychain, Blitz's reactions. They weren't just dots. They were trying to form a shape. Something dark was moving beneath the surface, and Mason wasn't going to wait for it to rise again. This time, they'd be ready. The living room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the desk lamp and the rhythmic flipping of manila folders. Mason sat hunched over a sea of old case files spread out on the table, coffee untouched, his brow furrowed in a familiar line of worry. Blitz lay nearby, head resting on crossed paws, eyes alert but heavy. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves with the same uneasy stillness that had settled into Mason's chest. He hadn't looked at these files in years. There was something about the way Lila had drawn the building, the narrow barred windows, the slanted roof, the half-erased figure of a man with dark gloves, and no face that had scratched at a memory buried deep in the old folders. Mason had seen those lines before, not in color pencil, but in black and white crime scene photos from a case that had nearly broken them both. Blitz stirred as Mason pulled out a thick file labeled Case 1427A, Federal Assist, Human Trafficking, 2019. Mason's fingers paused at the name. Jarrett Rourke, the one who got away. Back then, Blitz had been newer to the forces sharp, disciplined, and deadly precise. He'd been part of the takedown operation at the warehouse on West Harper, where 8 minors had been recovered. It was supposed to be a clean bust. They'd had evidence, surveillance, federal coordination, but Rourke had slipped through a rear exit with 2 unaccounted-for children. Everyone thought they had the whole network, until weeks later, both kids were found abandoned in another state, terrified and unresponsive. Rourke disappeared. And Blitz never forgot. Mason flipped through the incident reports. Photos, blueprints, witness statements. He held up one of the building's exterior shots, same angle, same bars over the windows, the same crooked tin roofing. He turned toward Blitz. "You were there," Mason said quietly, not as a question, but a realization. Blitz lifted his head. His ears twitched. His eyes met Mason's, and in that look was something that made Mason pause recognition. Not vague interest or coincidence, something deeper, more specific. Blitz got up slowly, padded over to the table, and placed his snout on the photograph, a low whine escaping his throat. Mason felt a chill ripple through him. He placed the photo next to Lila's drawing. It was almost identical. He sank into the couch, the weight of the discovery pressing on his lungs. How the hell did we miss this? Blitz sat beside him now, silent but watchful. His breathing was steady, but his body had stiffened. That kind of tension didn't come from memory, it came from association. Something in that house wasn't just familiar. It was still dangerous. Mason ran his hand through his hair. He thought about the surveillance being wiped, the missing child protection reports, the tattoo on Lila's wrist, the black SUV that Blitz reacted to with unmistakable unease. It was like the shadows of the past were folding back into the present hand. This time, the threads weren't fraying. They were tightening. He picked up the final arrest report. Rourke operated under 3 aliases, each one used in a different county. He had a preference for rental properties near isolated warehouses and never stayed longer than 6 months. 6 months. That was almost the exact window Mason estimated for Lila's captivity, based on what little she'd revealed. He reached for the current real estate ownership maps from the county clerk's website. One warehouse abandoned, but paid in cash matched the layout of both Lila's drawing and the blueprint from 2019. Its listed leaseholder? A defunct shell company traced to a P.O. box in Phoenix. "This is his pattern," Mason whispered. "It's him." A soft thump broke his thoughts. Blitz had placed a small object at Mason's feet, Lila's keychain. The one she'd clutched like it held the last piece of her soul. Mason picked it up and turned it over. A simple charm in the shape of a dog. German Shepherd. Its paint chipped, its tail broken. He'd seen it before. In the evidence, photos from 1427A. It had belonged to a girl named Becca rescued, but unclaimed. One of the kids taken by Rourke's group. They'd been unable to locate her parents. She'd been placed in foster care, then disappeared from the system entirely 2 years ago. "My dog is gone," Lila had whispered. Becca. Or was she Lila now? Mason's hands trembled slightly. Had she changed her name? Been renamed? Blitz let out a sharp bark, standing up suddenly. His ears pricked toward the front window. A second later, headlights swept across the room. A car slowed outside. Black SUV. Blitz growled low, stepping in front of Mason like instinct. The engine idled for a few seconds, then drove away. Mason's phone buzzed on the table. A text from Bryanthy's cybercrime friend he'd called after discovering the erased camera feeds. Warehouse server was remotely accessed. Footage wiped clean 8 hours before your visit. Not random, professional. Mason stared at the screen. So they knew he was looking. Someone was watching. Blitz hadn't forgotten. And now Mason couldn't afford to. He glanced again at the photo, then Lila's drawing, then the keychain. All the unspoken things she couldn't say were embedded in those lines and scratches and shapes. Trauma had its own language, one Blitz understood, and Mason was just beginning to decipher. He picked up the phone and dialed Brian again. His voice was steady, but his gut burned cold. "Hey, I need you to cross-reference all known aliases of Jarrett Rourke with property leases and traffic camera anomalies near old bus sites in the last year." "Already on it," Brian said. "You think he's active again?" "I think he never stopped." As he hung up, Mason turned to Blitz. "We missed him once. We don't get to miss him again." Blitz's tail flicked once, but his eyes never left the window. Outside, the dark held its breath. The key sat in the bottom drawer of Mason's desk, hidden beneath a stack of retirement paperwork he'd never filled out. It was old, its metal dulled and slightly bent near the teeth. Blitz sat by the door, ears alert but tail still, as if he could sense the weight of what was about to be unlocked. Mason turned it slowly in the file room lock. A soft metallic click, then silence. The overhead bulb buzzed as he stepped inside the precinct's cold archive. It smelled of dust and forgotten years, of case folders sealed with more questions than answers. He hadn't been in here since before the pain in his shoulder healed, since before the therapy and the months of silence between him and Blitz. It was Blitz who had taken the bullet, and it was Mason who had called the shot. The drawer labeled Operation Ember, closed case, groaned when he pulled it open. Yellowed folders slid against each other like dry leaves. He thumbed through them: names, locations, raids, partial reports. Redactions covered whole pages like black scars. His fingers stopped on a date, the 17th of March, 5 years ago. Blitz let out a low breath, almost a sigh, as if the dog recognized the air in that room, as if memory had a scent. Mason pulled out the file. It was thinner than it should have been. Ember had been massive multi-state, cross-agency, a web that spanned 3 years and took down over a dozen high-profile traffickers. But it had collapsed under its own weight after the final raid went wrong. A child had disappeared mid-rescue. A gunfight broke out early. And Blitz didn't come out whole. He opened the file and saw the image. A grainy surveillance shot. A man, tall, lean, face obscured by shadow, guiding children down into a transport van. In the corner, barely visible, was Blitz lunging forward, and Mason just a blur behind him, mid-run. He hadn't seen that photo in years. The name beside the image was handwritten in blue ink, Samuel Riker. Mason exhaled slowly. Riker had been the one that got away, not for lack of trying, but because the intel had been late, because the backup was too far, because someone with access had leaked their location 30 minutes before go time. He remembered the debrief. They moved the kids. Riker's clean. "No, he's not," Mason had said back then, jaw clenched, shoulder bleeding. "He's a ghost because we let him be." Embret. He stared now at the same black and white photo, and in his gut, he felt that ghost stirring again. From the hallway, Blitz gave a soft growl. Mason looked up. He stepped out with the folder and sat on the floor beside his partner. His back pressed against the cold concrete wall, and the folder lay open on his knee. Blitz leaned closer, his gaze fixed on the photo, as if he too remembered that night, the shouts, the heat, the chaos. Mason reached over and touched the scar just beneath Blitz's right shoulder, hidden under fur but still palpable beneath his fingers. "I thought we buried this," Mason murmured. Blitz didn't move. He just watched. The name Samuel Riker sat, like a stone in Mason's mind. It wasn't just another lead. It wasn't some shadow from the past. Lila's drawings, her whispered words, the mark on her wrist of everything pointed to something still alive. And that something had a name again. He flipped to the back of the file, a list of last known addresses, all scrubbed, some already rated. One circled in faded red pen with a single note scribbled beside it. "Deactivated safe house, Grover Creek." Mason's eyes narrowed. Grover Creek was 3 towns out, mostly farmland, abandoned barns, a string of unpaved roads no one used anymore. He picked up the folder and rose to his feet. As he did, Blitz moved to stand beside him, not in command, but in instinct, as if saying, "I'm ready." Mason hesitated for a beat. He remembered how Blitz had collapsed after that raid, how they'd said the K-9 was too wounded to work again, how Mason had fought to keep him, trained him again himself, slowly, one quiet walk at a time. This wasn't just about Lila anymore. This was their ghost. He tucked the file under his arm and reached for his phone. First call, Captain Jensen. Second, Child Services. Cancel Lila's transfer. Third, Julian Rhodes X, Cybercrime Unit. The only person Mason trusted to dig where others wouldn't. Then he knelt beside Blitz. "You remember Riker, don't you?" he said quietly. Blitz didn't bark, but his eyes, those unwavering, steady, intelligent eyes slocked onto Mason's with something deeper than confirmation. It was memory. It was duty. It was the flicker of unfinished business, reigniting in the silence between them. Outside, the wind rustled the flags, lining the precinct wall. Another cold front was coming in. Mason looked down at the folder again. Operation Ember wasn't over. It had just gone underground. And now, 5 years later, it had made a mistake. It left a child behind. A child who drew bars on houses. A child who whispered about gloves. A child who cried for a dog who hadn't come back. Mason stood. Blitz followed, quiet as ever. They didn't need sirens, just the file and each other. The storm had passed, but the air inside the station felt heavier than any summer downpour. Mason sat near the cot where Lila slept, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tight beneath his chin. The soft rhythm of her breath was the only thing that calmed the silence. Blitz lay curled at the foot of the cot, ears occasionally twitching as if responding to sounds only he could hear. Then it came, a whisper barely audible, fragile, like a thread caught in the wind. He took the others underground. Mason's head lifted. He leaned closer. Lila turned in her sleep, her small hand gripping the edge of the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. The man with gloves took them underground. Blitz stirred. Mason didn't move, didn't speak. He knew better than to wake a child running from nightmares. Sometimes the only truth they could speak was whispered through the fog of sleep. He reached for the recorder in his pocket and pressed it on, capturing her next breath, in case something else slipped through. But there was no more. Only a soft whimper and then the slow, shallow breaths of exhaustion. Blitz let out a low, barely there growl. Not out of warning, but recognition. That word underground had changed something in him. His head snapped toward Mason, golden eyes suddenly alert. Not just alert remembering. Mason stood slowly, careful not to disturb the girl. He stepped outside the room, Blitz following without command. In the hallway, under the dull hum of flickering lights, Mason crouched and met the dog's gaze. "Underground," he said softly. Blitz exhaled through his nose, ears tilting forward. Then he stood, turned toward the door, and scratched it decisively. It wasn't random. It was the kind of signal Mason hadn't seen in years. Not since their last assignment in Unit Echo. Blitz wasn't just responding, was tracking memory. Back in the office, Mason pulled up a digital map of the industrial district. His fingers moved instinctively, zooming past street levels and into the substructure. And then he saw its faint gray lines, mostly ignored on modern maps. Old storm drains, some decommissioned, others rumored to be sealed after the city's budget cuts a decade ago. But one passed directly beneath the warehouse. "Son of a bitch," Mason whispered. He flipped open the cold case files again. Operation Ember. Blitz had led the charge during a raid that failed because of a last-minute location switch. Intel had said the kids were inside a safe house above ground, but the house had been empty. A decoy. No one had thought to check beneath. The entry had been right there, hidden under the skeleton of forgotten city infrastructure. Mason's heart pounded against his ribs. He pulled out his phone and began snapping images of the drain map, highlighting entries marked sealed near the warehouse site. If someone had been using the underground network to traffic children in and out without detection, that would explain everything. The missing files, the wiped footage, even Lila's uncanny silence. "She's not just a survivor," Mason said aloud, voice low, like it wasn't meant for anyone but the dog beside him. "She's a witness." Blitz sat still, eyes fixed on him, unmoving but alive with alertness. His paw tapped once, a subtle thump on the tile floor. Agreement. Back in the sleeping room, Lila stirred again. Mason returned, crouching beside her as she shifted under the blanket. Her lips moved, but this time it was more of a hum. Mason gently placed a hand on the edge of the cot, careful not to startle her. "Lila," he said softly, "you said something about underground. Do you remember that?" She blinked slowly, the haze of sleep not fully gone. Her gaze didn't meet his, but she nodded, just once. "There were other kids with you?" he asked, keeping his voice like a whisper in a chapel. Another nod. Then slowly, her hand moved toward the edge of the blanket where she'd tucked a folded paper earlier. She handed it to him without words. Mason unfolded the drawing. Crayons. Jagged lines. But this one was different from the others. It wasn't the man with gloves this time. It was a series of tunnels, like a spider web under concrete. Small dot circles were drawn inside. One had an X over it. Mason traced his finger over the web. "You saw them down there," Lila whispered. "They didn't move." Mason felt the chill crawl under his collar. He looked over his shoulder at Blitz, who had stepped inside without sound, now sitting at Lila's side. He placed his head gently on the cot, beside her leg. Lila didn't flinch this time. Instead, she touched the top of Blitz's head. Her fingers rested there for a long while. "He tried to stop them," she said, barely audible. "He barked. Then they kicked him." Mason's breath caught. "Your dog?" he asked. She shook her head. "Your dog." Silence filled the room. Mason couldn't speak for a moment. The implication pierced deeper than any clue. If Blitz had been there, if he'd already tried to intervene, they were dealing with something far deeper than a cold case resurfacing. They were inside the same mazy end Blitz had been in it before. He rose slowly, gave Lila a nod of quiet reassurance, then walked out into the hallway again. Blitz followed. "We're not just chasing shadows anymore," he whispered. "We're walking into the dark, where the monsters still live." Outside, a black SUV passed slowly in the rain-slicked street. Blitz watched it without blinking. And then, for the first time in days, he growled. Mason rarely returned to his old locker at the precinct. Most of what was left there belonged to a man he no longer recognized before the operation that shattered his team, before Blitz's injury, before the silence in Lila's eyes. But tonight, something gnawed at him. A memory, half-formed and irritating like a sliver under the skin. Blitz sat quietly beside him, ears twitching, tail still. The locker creaked open, its hinges protesting like a wound reopened. Inside, an old service jacket, a photo of the original K9 unit, and a dented thermos he never threw out. Taped to the inside wall was a manila envelope labeled in handwriting only one person used: Captain Voss, dead for 3 years now, killed in the same failed raid that gave Blitz his scars. Mason pulled the envelope loose. Something small and solid shifted inside. A USB drive, its black casing scratched and almost forgotten. He didn't plug it in at the precinct. Something about it felt forbidden. Instead, he waited until they were home, until Lila was asleep on the couch, curled under an old quilt, Blitz lying watchful nearby. He booted his secure laptop, inserted the drive, and held his breath. A single folder blinked into view, titled Ember, redacted. Inside, no names, no reports, just strings of encrypted GPS coordinates. Dates attached to each one, every one matching a past surveillance op tied to Operation Ember. Except one. The last entry. No timestamp, no file description, just a lonely ping on a map blinking near the outskirts of town. An access tunnel beneath an abandoned freight yard, less than 10 miles from the warehouse. Mason stared. Blitz sat up, ears forward. He hovered the cursor over the blinking coordinate. Blitz whined, low and drawn out, then stood and walked closer, resting his chin on Mason's thigh. "Is that it?" Mason whispered. Blitz didn't move. He simply looked at him, one of those glances that bypassed language and bled into memory. Mason clicked to expand the location data. No formal report had ever marked this coordinate. No unit logged it. But something about it lingered. A small note appeared under the metadata, barely legible. Suppressed, by order of command, 09 divided by 17 divided by 19. That was the week after the Ember raid failed. The week Captain Voss died. The cursor trembled under Mason's fingers. He leaned back, running both hands down his face. "They knew," he muttered. "Someone found this and buried it." Blitz walked over to the window, growling faintly as headlights passed outside. A black SUV. The third one in an hour. The same model from the warehouse perimeter last week. No plates, no stickers, just enough gloss to look unmemorable. Mason shut the laptop. The hum of the night grew louder. A clock ticked in the kitchen. Somewhere, a branch tapped against the gutter like a coded knock. Then, a voice from the couch. "Underground." Lila mumbled in her sleep. Mason's breath hitched. "She said it again," he said softly. Same word, same tone. Blitz turned back from the window, pupils locked on Mason. He patted over, resting one paw on the edge of the table where the laptop still sat. The room felt charged, like the second before a storm splits the sky. Mason reopened the map, overlaying it with the city's storm drain schematics. It was a puzzle no one had been meant to finish, but he remembered the patterns. He remembered the scent of dirt and ammonia beneath Ember's hideouts, the way Blitz used to pause at specific vents like they were breathing. He marked the coordinate. Underneath that blinking dot, the blue lines of the storm drain system twisted and bent, leading directly beneath the old warehouse. He zoomed in. One entrance, only accessible through a welded grate that had been sealed off 10 years ago after a sewer collapse. But the grate was city jurisdiction, and Mason knew the guy who handled that district. If someone had reopened it, he picked up his phone, dialing by muscle memory. "Victor Gray," the man answered after the first ring. "Ex-cybercrimes. Now private, quiet, trusted." "I found a suppressed coordinate from Ember," Mason said without preamble. "The one we weren't supposed to see." "A pause. You sure?" Blitz just confirmed it. Another pause. "Then you've got about 6 hours before whoever's watching that feed gets notified. Can you reroute?" "I can try. But if someone high up flagged it, you're going in half blind." "I've been worse. Not with a kid under your roof." Mason glanced at Lila, still sleeping. Her tiny hand clutched around Blitz's chew toy like it was a talisman. "I'm not taking her. Just Blitz and me." Victor sighed. "I'll send you a fresh line and a one-time decryptor for the tunnel camps if they're still running." "Thanks." "Oh, and Mason?" "Yeah? Riker's still active. I've seen his name on encrypted exchanges. He's moving something big. This might be your only shot." The line went dead. Mason sat there for a long moment, the quiet of the house settling again, but heavier, more aware. Blitz nudged his knee once. Firm. "All right, partner," Mason whispered. "Let's finish what we missed." Outside, the SUV had vanished, but in its place, Blitz's reflection in the window looked almost ghost-like eyes. Dark, body still. A sentinel, waiting for the truth to rise from the earth. The gas station was tucked along the rural highway like a forgotten thought, just a flickering neon sign, one dusty camera mounted above the soda machine, and the humming of overhead lights tired of holding on. Mason stood in the small manager's office, the stale smell of microwave burritos clinging to the walls. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, replaying the footage for the 4th time, while Blitz sat rigid beside him, eyes never leaving the screen. The grainy timestamp read 2:17 a.m. 2 weeks ago. Just a few hours before Mason had found Lila, the screen jerked slightly, then steadied. Headlights cut through the fog, and a large black van eased into Fremeno logos. No stickers. Windows tinted beyond legality. It parked for no longer than 30 seconds. "Pause it there," Mason muttered, eyes narrowing. The frame froze. In the background, barely visible beneath a shaft of orange light cast by the lone street lamp, a dark shape was briefly seen in the back of the van's slatted crate, metal bars catching the light just enough to be seen, then swallowed again by shadow. Blitz let out a low growl. "Easy, boy," Mason whispered, but his own throat had gone dry. He reversed, frame by frame. There. The outline sharpened for a second. It wasn't empty. A shape inside. Curled. Still. And then the van was gone. Mason leaned back, rubbing a palm over his face. The license plate falsified. No match on state or federal databases. The footage had almost been overwritten. If not for the gas station owner's habit of keeping an old backup drive, just in case, it would have disappeared forever. From the living room, a soft voice broke the quiet. "Mr. Mason?" Lila stood at the door. Bare feet, oversized sweatshirt, holding the sleeve like a safety rope. Her hair still held that slight waviness from her last bath, and her eyes, though clearer, carried the weight of things she hadn't yet said. "I saw the light," she said, hesitating. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Mason said gently. "Come here." She patted over, her small hand brushing against Blitz's back as she passed. He didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned into it. A quiet acknowledgement. Mason didn't say anything, just hit play again. The black van rolled in. Lila froze. Her knees stiffened mid-step. One hand instinctively reached for Blitz's scruff, fingers tightening in his fur. Her voice, when it came, was barely air. "That's it." Mason didn't move. She pointed. "That's the van. That's where they took, where they kept." Her hand trembled. She bit her lip. Hard, but tears still pushed through. Mason kneeled beside her. "You don't have to keep going." "I do," she whispered. "Because Kai was in there too." Mason's breath caught. "Kai?" he repeated softly. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks now. Not in a rush, but in the way sorrow drips from a memory that's never really gone. "My dog," she said, voice cracked. "He's a German shepherd, like Blitz, only darker, with a scar on his nose. They took him too, when they took me." Mason's eyes met Blitz's. The dog's ears perked, eyes flickering from the screen to the girl, then back. A knowing, a memory shared without words. Did Kai protect you?" Mason asked, voice low. "He tried," she said. "They hit him, a lot, but he kept trying. They said dogs like him were good inventory. Then one day he didn't come back." She didn't cry louder. She just stopped speaking. That was louder. Blitz slowly nudged her side with his head. She looked down, and without thinking, her small arms wrapped around his neck. Blitz didn't move, just stayed there, his tail giving a faint thump against the floor. A quiet promise. Mason sat back down, heart aching like an old scar pulled open. Lila's memories weren't just scattered trauma. They were pieces, clues, a pattern. "You said they kept you there," Mason said. "Do you remember anything else? Something that might help us find Kai?" She hesitated, then slowly nodded. "There was a number," she whispered, "painted on the inside of the van. Not big, but I saw it once through the bars. I think it was 63, a 27. Mason's fingers flew over the keyboard. Not a plate, but maybe a fleet code. He logged into an old tracking tool. His cybercrime contact had left him with an internal transit mapping tool meant for commercial use. After a few tries, it hit. "Industrial transport unit," he muttered. "Registered out of Black Hollow." Blitz growled again. The name stirred something in him. "Blitz remembers," Mason said. "He's been there." Lila turned. "Where?" "A depot. Abandoned now. Used to be a train switchyard. But during Operation Ember, we got a lead there. Never panned out. We thought it was just a front." He stared at the frozen image on screen, the black van, the crate, the brief glimpse of a curled shape. But Lila's words cut deeper than any lead. Kai was in there. Mason exhaled slowly, fists clenched. "No more ghosts," he said, his voice solid. "We're going to find him, and whoever's still doing this." Blitz stood, body tense but focused. He was ready too. Outside, the night held its silence, But inside that silence now was purpose and the ghost of a bark that hadn't yet faded. The auto garage stood at the edge of a crumbling industrial block quiet in a way that felt wrong. Fluorescent light buzzed above the open bay door. But the inside was dark, abandoned. No engines, no movement. The kind of stillness that carries weight. Mason stepped out of the truck, hand resting near his sidearm. Blitz was already alert, ears forward, muscles tense like a drawn bow. He didn't bark, never barked unless Mason said the word, but he was breathing hard, low, controlled. A sign Mason had learned to read long ago. Something was under the surface, close. The tip had come in anonymously, routed through a child protection hotline, just a street name, a whispered voice. They're beneath the cars. Look for the red door. And there it was, tucked in a side wall between stacks of old tires and a rusted engine block. A faded red steel door, half covered in grime. Blitz moved toward it, nose sweeping side to side, his body drawing invisible lines across the air. Mason signaled him to hold, then tested the knob. It gave with a mechanical creak. The scent hit him first sterile, metallic, mingled with ammonia and something sour underneath. Blitz whined, just once, then shoved past Mason and descended into the dark. The stairwell was narrow, metal, caged in rust. Mason followed fast, heart thudding in his ribs like a war drum. His flashlight caught concrete walls, old flood stains, and a glint of something recent. Wet footprints. Small, children's footprints. At the bottom, a hallway stretched out, too narrow for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder. Pipes dripped along the ceiling. The air felt like it hadn't moved in years. Then came the sound Blitz's snarl. Sharp, controlled, but it carried. Mason rounded the corner and saw the door. A reinforced steel hatch bolted into the wall, scratched with initials, some fresh, some fading. Beneath them, a symbol, a circle within a triangle. Blitz pressed his nose to the frame and let out a low, guttural growl. Mason yanked the handle. It opened with resistance, as if protesting. Inside, silence. Rows of metal cages lined the walls. Some still had blankets, others discarded shoes, a small teddy bear with one eye missing. Mason stepped inside, his boots echoing too loud on the concrete floor. The cages were empty. The children were gone. But the air told the story. Still warm, a styrofoam plate of half-eaten food, a toothbrush left in a paper cup. One cage had a tangle of blonde hair caught in the lock. They moved fast, Mason muttered, voice tight. He knelt, examining the floor. Dust had been swept in places hurriedly. A drag mark led from one cage to the other side of the room, where a second door stood ajar. It opened to a narrow tunnel, dug into the earth, shored with wood and sheet metal. A rat scurried by, disappearing into the dark. Blitz stood frozen at the mouth of the tunnel, tail stiff, chest rising fast. His eyes didn't blink. He'd been here before. Mason felt the twist in his stomach tighten. They're still using the old Ember routes, he whispered. The realization came with the weight of memory Operation Ember, a failed raid, a storm of bullets and fire. Blitz had taken a round to the flank that day. They thought they had shut it all down. But it hadn't ended. It had gone underground, literally. Mason stood, turning slowly. They were here hours ago, not days. Blitz paced the room, nose to the floor, sniffing cages one by one. Then he stopped at a metal bucket, nosing it gently. Mason approached. Inside were zip ties, used syringes, and a shredded blue bandana. He picked it up carefully with gloves, child-sized, bloodied. The initials KW were stitched into the corner, in careful thread. Guy, Mason murmured. Blitz whined. Loud. A memory returned, Lila's voice breaking when she whispered. That's where Kai was. Her German shepherd. The only thing she had clung to before the silence took over. Mason's grip tightened. Someone had taken a dog trained to protect and turned it into a captive. And they weren't just taking children, they were taking K9S. Blitz wasn't the only one anymore. Suddenly, Blitz stiffened, head snapping toward the hallway. A sound distant metal on metal. Faint. Then silence. Mason reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Mason Ward. I need backup at 1442 Pelham. Possible Ember facility cages found. Subjects fled. Repeat, children were here. A static pause. Then, understood. UTA, 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Mason looked at the tunnel. Dirt shifted slightly, as if something had just passed through. The walls groaned. He wasn't going to wait. He dropped to one knee beside Blitz. Track! Blitz's ears perked. One note and he was gone into the dark. Mason followed, flashlight dancing over uneven walls. The tunnel bent sharply, then split. Blitz sniffed both sides, then veered left, his paws silent on the earth. 30 yards in, the passage opened into a wider chamber emptied, but still marked by life. A camp chair. A burned-out candle. On the wall, drawings in crayon. Sunday, stars, and a black van. Below it, one word in a child's handwriting. Run. Mason stared at it, heart twisting. They weren't just captives. They were aware. Suddenly, Blitz growled low and steady. Something moved ahead. A breath. A scuffle. Mason raised his weapon. Show yourself. Silence. Then a flash. Someone ran. A shadow against the wall, smaller than a man but older than a child, thin, fast. Blitz lunged forward, but Mason held him back. Whoever it was knew the tunnels better. They were losing time. Mason exhaled sharply and pulled out his phone, snapping photos of the walls, the cages, the bandana, the crayon drawing. The world needed to see this, not as evidence, as truth. The clock read 2:47 a.m., though Mason had stopped paying attention to time hours ago. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood under the old house were the only sounds accompanying his exhaustion. His eyes burned from staring too long at cold leads maps, witness statements, storm drain schematics, but none of it fit. Not yet. Not until they found where the children had been taken. Blitz lay at the far end of the living room, his body rigid. He hadn't slept either. At first, Mason thought it was just residual tension from the failed raid at the garage. The moment they had opened that trapdoor and the stench of bleach and urine had hit them, he knew they were late. Minutes, maybe hours too late. The cages were still warm to the touch. But something deeper gnawed at Blitz tonight. His ears twitched at every rustle outside. His eyes didn't close, even when Mason turned off the lights. He kept looking toward the front door, unmoving, unblinking. Then came the low growl. It was barely audible, a vibration more than a sound, but Mason recognized it instantly. It wasn't aggression. It was warning. Blitz stood, muscles taut, nostrils flaring toward the window, toward the dark. Mason rose, instinct kicking in like a current snapping across his spine. He reached for the sidearm tucked into the drawer by the kitchen. Blitz was already at the door, tail low, body curved, slightly left to shepherd silent language for danger near. "Stay close," Mason whispered. He pulled the door open slowly. The night outside was heavy. Fog curling like breath around the porch. The street was silent. No cars passed. No dogs barked in distant yards. Just the static hush of a world holding its breath. Then he saw it. A note, folded once, stabbed into the hood of his car with a hunting knife. The metal glinted under the porch light, dew clinging to the hilt like blood. Blitz let out a sharper growl now, teeth showing. He darted toward the steps but halted just short, nose raised. Mason approached slowly, sweeping the area with his eyes before pulling the note free. The blade had sunk deep into the steel, leaving a gouge he didn't need to touch to feel. He unfolded the paper. "You're not done with us. Neither is your dog." The handwriting was uneven, rushed, but deliberate. A signature of someone who wanted this to feel personal. Because it was. Mason's stomach knotted. Blitz circled the car twice, ears still high, then returned to Mason's side. He nudged his leg once. Urgently. Almost protectively. Mason crouched and placed a hand on Blitz's back. The shepherd's body was warm, heartbeat pounding beneath layers of trained restraint. "This wasn't random," Mason said under his breath. "They were here." Blitz nudged him again, this time with more force. Then he looked to the yard, then back to the streetlight, where shadows clung unusually thick. A message. A test. They weren't trying to kill him, not yet. They wanted him to feel watched, to remember what it was like to be prey. And the part about Blitz neither is your dog that chilled Mason more than anything, because it meant they remembered him. From Operation Ember, from the raid that went sideways, from the day Blitz had taken a bullet and saved a child's life. They knew this dog. They feared him. Inside, Mason secured the doors and set a trip alarm across the porch. Blitz sat by the window, watching, waiting. Mason studied the note again under lamplight. No prints, no identifying marks. But there was something in the handwriting, the way the N in neither curved inward, the way your dog was underlined not once, but twice. A habit, a tell. He reached for an old folder. Samuel Riker's profile, the inked interrogation notes. The ones from the wiretap room, back before the Ember bust had gone silent. And there at Waspage 6, a note Riker had written to a contact, confiscated and scanned into evidence. The West entries compromised. Pull back, no names. Same crooked N. Same pressure points. It was him. Riker knew he was being hunted, and now he'd made it personal. Not just for Mason, but for Blitz. The German shepherd, as if sensing the name echo in Mason's mind, let out a short, low bark, then turned. His paw tapped lightly against Mason's leg. Just once. It was Blitz's way of saying, "We move at dawn." The night air was still. But inside the cabin, something had begun to stir. Lila's scream broke the silence, first a sound not of the present, but of something dredged from memory. Guttural, raw, helpless. Mason dropped the wrench in his hand and bolted from the back shed, heart in his throat, thinking the worst. But when he burst through the door, no intruder greeted him. Only the shaking form of the girl, tangled in her blanket on the couch, clawing the air like she was trapped inside her own body. And Blitz. Blitz was pacing, not barking, not growling, pacing. A tight circle, over and over again near the doorframe, his ears slicked back, tail stiff, shoulders hunched, the same way Mason had seen him move the night after the Kunar mission, the same night everything in both their lives had fractured. "Lila," Mason whispered, kneeling beside her gently. "Hey, you're safe. You're here. It's okay." She blinked, disoriented. Lip trembling, sweat beaded her hairline. She wasn't looking at him, she was looking through him, like her gaze was locked on a memory she couldn't control. Then, in a rasp that was barely more than breath, she murmured, "The pipes, the sound," they scream. That's when Mason noticed the heater had kicked on. That high-pitched metallic hum when the coils heated it was faint, ordinary, but not to her, and not to Blitz. The dog had stopped pacing now. But he stood planted between Mason and the window, rigid, chest rising fast. He didn't need words to show what was happening inside him. Mason knew that look, that haunted, fractured look, because he'd seen it once before on a day scorched into his bones like a brand. Kunar Province, 2050. It had been an extraction gone sideways, a bomb factory hidden beneath a school. 3 children inside. One of them, barely 7, had latched onto Blitz's neck, like he knew instinctively that this dog was safety. And Blitz had carried him out, flames licking their heels. But the screams didn't stop ringing. Not for the boy, not for Blitz, not for Mason. That night, Blitz wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't even lie down. He just paced the length of the barracks' 14 steps and a turn, over and over and over, just like now. "Blitz," Mason whispered, gently laying his hand on the shepherd's shoulder. "It's not then. You're here. She's here." The dog's breath hitched once, and then something unexpected happened. Blitz walked, unprompted, to Lila. She'd curled herself tight on the couch, knees tucked, shaking. Blitz nudged his head under her arm. She flinched, but then her hand landed on his fur. It was so small, so unsure, fingers trembling as they made contact with the thick ridge of his neck. But once it rested there, just a second or two longer than a flinch would have lasted, Blitz lay down, right at her feet, chin against her shin. And Lila exhaled. It wasn't peace, it wasn't healing, but it was something. A fragile bridge made not of words, but of presence. Blitz didn't need to speak, and she didn't need to be brave. They just understood. Mason leaned back slowly, not wanting to break the spell. He knew enough about trauma to recognize the unspoken. Some wounds only answered to silence. Some healing could only begin in the quiet places where language failed and where something soft and loyal stayed. Minutes passed. Blitz's eyes drifted closed. One ear twitched. His breathing slowed. Lila didn't move her hand. And for the first time since they'd brought her here, she wasn't flinching at shadows. Outside, the woods whispered as wind moved through the trees. The night no longer felt still, it felt sacred, like some ancient thread had been tied between two broken creatures who didn't need to be fixed to begin mending. Mason stood, his heart caught in a strange mix of awe and grief. Because what Blitz had just done, what he always did, was something no training had ever taught. No protocol, no mission order. It was instinct, raw and unfiltered, born from the same wellspring of empathy that had made Blitz charge through fire for that Afghan boy, and now lay still for this trembling girl. And Mason, he hadn't realized until this moment just how much Blitz had held inside. Just how much he had held inside. Later that night, as the heater quieted and the cabin dimmed into sleep, Mason sat by the fire, the cold file on Operation Ember in his lap. He wasn't reading it, just holding it, feeling its weight. He glanced toward the couch. Lila was finally sleeping. Blitz remained at her feet, his head resting over her ankles like a sentinel carved from living loyalty. And Mason whispered not to either of them, but to the night itself. "We're going to find them. Every last one." The embers crackled. Blitz didn't move. But Mason swore just for a second he saw the dog's tail flick. A signal. A vow. A memory rekindled. They weren't alone in this fight. Not anymore. The sky was still the color of bruised ash when Blitz raised his nose to the wind. Mason had learned to read the dog's body like a second language ears, twitching, muscles stiffening, breath-changing tempo. Something was different now. Blitz wasn't just alert. He was certain. "Go on, buddy," Mason whispered, stepping aside as the German shepherd surged ahead, paws crunching over the frostbitten leaves. The forest around them was dense and indifferent, but Blitz carved a purpose through Itas, if chasing something only he could sense. They'd been circling the perimeter of the last known coordinate for 2 hours. No fresh vehicle tracks. No cell phone pings. Nothing but the sound of wind moving through trees like ghosts looking for names. But now, Blitz had a direction. Mason followed, boots sinking into the damp moss. With every step deeper into the woods, the tension inside his chest coiled tighter. It wasn't just the fear of what they might find. It was the hope. About 20 minutes in, Blitz slowed to a low crawltail stiff, ears pinned, the whites of his eyes showing. Ahead, nearly obscured by thorns and saplings, stood a decaying cabin, leaning to one side like it was trying to fall away from the world. Its windows were blacked out with something paint or soot. No sign of movement. But Mason felt it in his gut. This place knew something. Blitz didn't bark. He just lowered his body, nose hovering above the damp earth as he veered toward the side of the structure. Mason scanned the perimeter quickly. No cameras, no sensors, just a rusted generator and a wheelbarrow full of empty food tins. It looked abandoned, but the hair on Blitz's neck was standing up. They found the collar under a bed of leaves torn. Muddy, but unmistakable. The silver tag clung to the last letter of a name nearly worn off by time and teeth. "Kai," Mason whispered. His breath hitched. Blitz sniffed it once, then licked it gentle, almost reverent. The way a soldier might touch the patch of a fallen comrade. Mason's fingers curled into a fist. Inside the cabin, the smell hit first. Mildew, metal, and old blood. Blitz didn't hesitate. He pushed through the door with his shoulder, moving low, room by room, clearing corners with a precision Mason hadn't seen in years. The place was stripped. No furniture left intact. Shelves empty. Walls scratched. But near the back, beneath a loose floorboard, Blitz stopped. One paw scratched once, then twice. Mason knelt, pried it open. There was nothing but a thin, battered ledger tucked inside a plastic sleeve. Water damage had blurred most of the ink, but one pagetorn, smudged, was still legible. Column A, names. Column B, ages. Column C, Codes. Some were crossed out. Others had numbers scribbled next to them dates, prices. Mason's pulse thudded in his ears as he copied everything onto his notebook, his hand shaking. Then he froze. One of the name shaft faded was circled 3 times in red. Lila. Blitz gave a low growl behind him, turning toward the doorway. Mason followed the dog's eyes and saw nothing. No movement, no sound. But he no longer believed in silence being safe. He slid the notebook into his vest, secured the collar in a Ziploc bag. His voice was low but certain. We got what we came for. Outside, the wind had shifted. Blitz's tail swayed once, as if releasing tension, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching the trees. As they retraced their steps, Mason looked back only once. The cabin seemed to disappear into the forest again, like it was never meant to be found. And somehow, he knew. This trail wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The sun had begun to rise, but its light barely reached through the canopy above, where the branches clung tightly to the remnants of the night. Mason sat on an overturned crate outside the tent, the torn page from the ledger clutched in his left hand, its edges trembling in the wind. Blitz lay nearby, ears alert but body still, sensing the storm behind his handler's silence. Mason's eyes had been on the same spot for 10 minutes one line, near the bottom of the list. The ink had faded in parts, but the shape of the letters, they were branded into his memory now. Lila, R13, reacquired target. He didn't even hear the footsteps behind him until a soft voice cut through the haze. Coffee's hot, Elena said, kneeling beside the fire pit. Or whatever passes for coffee out here. Mason didn't answer. She waited, watching him from the corner of her eye. His posture was all tension, the kind of weight that didn't show in muscle but in the way a man's breath shortens when the past catches up. He finally spoke, quiet, like it hurt to push the words out. She wasn't missing Elena. Elena looked over, her brows knitting. What? She was, taken back. He lifted the page, tapped it once with his finger. Reacquired, like a shipment that wandered off. The fire crackled between them, but it did nothing to warm the hollow in his chest. He ran his thumb over the line again, slower this time, as if that could erase it. Lila, R13, reacquired target. Beneath the note, in smaller handwriting, was a number. 5到1422. A code, or maybe a date. He didn't know yet, but every fiber of his being told him it mattered. He exhaled through clenched teeth. I thought she'd been lost in that raid. All this time, I blamed myself for not getting to her in time. But they had her. They never let her go. His voice broke around the last word, but he didn't turn away, just stared at the paper like it might bleed if he looked hard enough. Blitz stood, walking over. He rested his chin gently on Mason's knee, a grounding weight. Steady, present. Elena sat down next to him on the crate, her shoulder brushing his. She didn't say it out loud, but he felt it. I'm still here. Mason pointed to another name farther up the list. Kai. M205. Uncooperative. The memory came back in pieces. Kai's collar in the dirt, the way Blitz had paused at it like a soldier saluting the fallen. M205. That was a military designation. M for male. 205, possibly his training number. That meant Lila's R13 was likely R for recovery unit, 13th of her kind. A program, not a name. They weren't rescuing children, he said hoarsely. They were collecting them. Elena's jaw tightened, like assets, like property. Blitz shifted, growling low. Not at anything in particular, but as if echoing Mason's disgust. The wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the clearing. The sun tried again to break through the clouds, but only a thin ray touched the corner of the page in Mason's hand, illuminating one last scribbled detail. Behavioral anomalies persistent. Reindoctrination ordered. That was under Lila's name. Mason closed his eyes. She fought them, he whispered. Even after they took her back, she still fought. He saw her in his mind, as she once was quiet but fierce, hair braided tight, a scar across her eyebrow from the day they broke her out the first time. She was only 13 then. Now, she'd be 17. Old enough to remember. Old enough to hate. He folded the page carefully, slid it into the inside pocket of his vest. Not because it was evidence, but because it was hers. The last proof she was still alive. She's out there somewhere, Mason said, standing slowly. And she's still fighting. Elena stood too. Then we go after her. Number. Mason looked toward the tree line. We get her out. This time, for good. Blitz barked on sharp, certain. It was time. The storm wasn't on the horizon. It was already here coiled beneath the surface, waiting to be named. Mason stood in the dim glow of the operations table, hands braced against its edge. The grainy screenshots flickered on the monitor's images harvested from a whistleblower scraping the deep web. An auction. Children displayed not as people, but as lot numbers. Silent, still, terrified. They're calling it Project Renewal, the informant had whispered. It's not just selling them. It's repurposing. Mason didn't ask what that meant. He didn't want to know. But the bile in his throat suggested he already did. Blitz lay beside the table, head on his paws, but eyes alert. His body had stilled in that quiet, coiled posture Mason recognized from deployment, every nerve open to command. But this wasn't war, not the kind any of them had trained for. Lila stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her voice brittle. You can't keep me out of this. You're not going in, Mason said, eyes still on the screen. That's final. It's Kai, my dog, my family. Her voice trembled at the edges, like a window pane bracing against wind. Mason looked at her, really looked. In the past days, the girl who'd first clung to silence had changed. There was grit beneath her grief now, but also risk, desperation. The kind that drove people to do reckless things for the ones they loved. Blitz will go in. He's wired, Mason said. The cam in his harness will stream everything back to us in real time. There's a decoy handler posing as a buyer. You'll stay here. End of discussion. She didn't argue again. She only walked over slowly, knelt beside Blitz, and touched his collar. Kai listens to one word, she whispered into Blitz's fur. Wait, if you see him say it, just say it. He'll know someone remembered. Blitz's ear twitched, then settled. When Mason turned to gather his gear, Lila stood and brushed past him. He didn't see the note. Didn't feel her hand slip the folded scrap into Blitz's vest pocket. She didn't need to say goodbye because, this time, she wasn't done either. The warehouse was a fortress carved into rust and shadows. The entry point had been arranged through the contact. No real names, no questions. Only cash, scanned eyes, and the promise of silence. Blitz walked beside the decoy handler Agent Reynolds, dressed in a tailored coat and dark gloves, the kind that could buy you anonymity in rooms where people were priced by usefulness. The microcamera nestled just beneath Blitz's collar flicked on. The live feed pulsed green in Mason's headset. Infiltration team in place. Reynolds spoke low into his mic. Uploading visual now. The room they entered reeked of bleach and cigar smoke. The kind of place where nothing ever grew, only withered. Rows of cages lined the far walno bars, just black mesh and narrow glass windows. Behind each one, a child. Sedated. Maybe. Maybe not. The lighting was deliberate, cruelly dim. So buyers could imagine rather than see. So truth could stay blurred. Blitz's footage was silent, but Mason could feel the dog's pulse like a second heartbeat in his chest. The German Shepherd's gait had changed less steady, more rigid. Blitz had scented something. Kai? Mason whispered into his mic, even though Blitz couldn't hear him. But Blitz stopped. Just for a second. His nose lifted, air filtered, and then he moved again. Agent Reynolds leaned toward one of the auctioneers, speaking in that tight, hushed tone designed for negotiations without consequence. Mason tuned him out. He only watched Blitzow. The dog veered left, tail twitching once, sharply. And then Blitz froze. He was staring at something behind one of the partial barriers. The footage shuddered as his head tilted. There was a cage, slightly larger than the rest. Inside, a dog crate. Metal, scratched. Inside that, a Shapa German Shepherd, curled in the far corner, ribs pushing through fur like broken piano keys. Kai. Mason sat forward. Confirm visual, he said. Can we get closer? Reynolds hesitated. Too risky. Movement might alert them. We don't need movement, Mason said, his voice barely a breath. We've got memory. Blitz stared at the cage. Then, without noise, without motion, his mouth moved. The camera didn't catch the sound. But the handler whispered, astonished, "He just said something. One word." Mason closed his eyes. Wait. Lila had known. She knew. In the command center, Mason barely noticed when his hand curled into a fist. Outside, beyond the range of cameras, Lila sat in the van, refusing to cry. She watched the silent feed, saw the blur of her dog behind the bars. And then, Blitz's steady frame, unmoving, just watching. She mouthed the word to herself. Wait. A warning. A promise. And deep inside the auction floor, something shifted. Because Blitz didn't just see a mission. He saw a kindred. The warehouse squatted in the darkness like something forgotten by time silent, hulking, with corrugated metal walls that shivered in the wind. It sat at the edge of a disused shipping yard, its windows blacked out, its front guarded by nothing more than shadows and silence. But beneath the stillness, evil festered. Inside, Blitz padded carefully, each pawfall a whisper on the cold concrete floor. A micro-camera embedded into his collar streamed back to the surveillance van where Mason sat, eyes locked on the monitor, jaw clenched. The feed crackled faintly, stabilizing into dim, grainy visuals. The dog's movements were deliberate, measured. He wasn't just a canine anymore. He was memory, incarnatuned, sharpened, forged by trauma. This wasn't the first time he'd been in a place like this. The air smelled the same. Rust, oil, fear. A decoy handler in a black jacket walked beside Blitz, posing as a buyer's guard. The man's silence wasn't part of the act, was sweating through his shirt, eyes darting around like a rabbit in a fox's den. The camera shifted as Blitz's head turned left. There, behind a row of crates, the glow of red heat lamps illuminated makeshift cages, not kennel cages, each one welded from scrap metal and chain-link fencing. Within them, children, 10, maybe 15, eyes swollen from tears, skin bruised, clothing torn. Some stared blankly into space. Others shook with silent sobs. A girl with matted blonde hair pressed herself into the far corner of her enclosure, clutching a threadbare teddy bear to her chest like armor. A boy no more than 5 sat cross-legged, tracing invisible lines on the cement with his finger. No one spoke. Their silence was louder than screams. Mason's hand closed into a fist as the image burned across the screen. In the van, Lila gasped, unable to look away. Then, movement. A masked man stepped into framatol, suited, gloves tight against pale skin. His face hidden by a custom silver masquerade mask that gleamed under the warehouse's sodium lights. A voice, altered through a modulator, echoed through a concealed speaker system. Lot 23, male, 8 years old, unique resistance profile, previous conditioning failed, untouched since reacquisition. Blitz tensed. The man turned and gestured toward one particular cage near the back. The camera angle dipped, refocused. There, chained to the wall by the ankle, slumped in a corner like a discarded shadow kai. Mason's breath hitched. The boy's hair was longer, tangled. His arms bore the telltale signs of restraint. Angry red marks ringed his wrists. His shirt hung loosely over a frame that had grown thinner, ribs visible even beneath fabric. But the eyes, those were Kai's. Still alert, still stubborn, still there. He lifted his head slowly, as if drawn by instinct, and locked eyes with Blitz. And Blitz remembered. Not the moment of loss, but the one before it, before everything broke. A backyard in late summer. Kai throwing a stick, laughing, his cheeks flushed with sunshine. Blitz chasing after it with reckless joy. That day had smelled of cut grass and safety. That day was gone. Now, this. The German shepherd growled softly, low, and primal. It wasn't for show. It came from somewhere deeper than memory. Something ancient, protective, unforgiving. In the van, the monitor shook slightly as Mason slammed his fist against the console. "Hold position," came the voice from HQ. "No," Mason said under his breath, voice trembling. "Not when he's right there." The camera swayed again as Blitz shifted closer, muscles taut, ears back. He angled his body, placing himself instinctively between Kai and the masked man, even from 20 feet away. The decoy handler tugged on the leash, uneasy. Blitz ignored him. Back in the cage, Kai blinked. He saw the dog. Recognition dawned slowly, like light bleeding into a room long kept dark. His lips moved, silent. Blitz? The boy didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply reached out with a trembling hand, fingers brushing empty air. But then, a sharp whistle cut through the room. Another man, broader, with a shock of gray hair and a blood-red lapel pin, barked an order in a language not immediately familiar. 2 guards approached Kai's cage, unlocking the gate. Mason shot upright. What are they doing? Are they moving him? Leela stood behind him now, clutching Blitz's Spara vest. He's being sold. No, Mason whispered. Not tonight. On the screen, Blitz's body stiffened. He took 1 step forward, then another. A handler's grip faltered. Blitz lunged. Not to attack, to signal. The footage blurred for a split second as Blitz threw his weight into the handler's legs, knocking the man to the ground just as the microcam caught a glimpse of the Transactiona briefcase exchanged. A handshake. One of the guards reached for Kai. Blitz barked. A sharp, thunderous, heart-stopping bark. The children in the cages stirred. Some cried. One screamed. Chaos. The feed went black. In the van, Mason stood frozen. A second passed. Then the emergency line burst to life dispatch reporting multiple inbound units. Sirens, engines, screams. Lila stood still, eyes on the screen that now showed only static. Her voice barely a whisper. He remembered. It happened in silence first. The kind of silence that hums before a storm too still, too heavy. Blitz's ears flicked beneath the shadows of the warehouse rafters. His breathing, controlled, measured. Behind his right shoulder, the disguised handler gave the faintest signal, and miles away, inside the van, pulsing with surveillance feeds, Mason whispered, "Go." The night cracked open. Flashbangs exploded with a scream of light. Doors burst inward. Shadows turned to silhouettes armed with rifles and Kevlar. The children wailed short, choked cries from metal cages like cold confessionals. Blitz launched into motion, a phantom of muscle and memory, eyes blazing with the kind of clarity that only came with purpose. His first target was the man in the crimson jacketone hand on a clipboard, the other fumbling for a pistol. Blitz didn't bark. He didn't need to. His body struck like a thrown boulder, sending the man crashing into a crate of auction monitors. Screams rose behind metal grates. Chaos was airborne. Mason's boots struck the concrete with the task force flanking both sides. Gunfire echoed like thunder in a tin can, but their mission was clear. Secure the children. No room for mistakes. No time for hesitations. They moved with a grace that only came from guilt-driven preparation. Left flank. Move! Mason, you with us? I see Kai, Mason shouted into the comm. Repeat. Visual on Kai. At the far end of the warehouse, past rows of stacked shipping pallets, Blitz had locked eyes with the boy. Chained, ribs visible, knees curled to his chest like he was trying to fold into nothing. But his eyes, those wide, bruised eyes, recognized Blitz. Blitz didn't hesitate. A guard raised his rifle toward the cage. Blitz flew. The German Shepherd collided mid-lunge, jaws clamping around the gunman's wrist. Bone crunched beneath fur and muscle. The man screamed like he hadn't screamed in years. Blitz let go only to pivot and slam into the second figure, moving toward Kai's cage. His growl was guttural now, rising from somewhere ancient in his chest. Not anger, not rage, purpose. A voice crackled in Mason's earpiece. Cage is rigged. Chains have pressure triggers. Copy, Mason growled. We'll need cutters. Now. He sprinted toward the cluster of cages. Each child looked like a shadow of life-skin, too pale, eyes too old. Lila's words flashed in his mind like lightning behind closed eyes. Find Kai. He did more than find him. He remembered him. Blitz pawed gently at the lock, then circled, barking on sharp, clear. Mason arrived seconds later, skidding to a stop beside the cage. Kai, Mason said softly, kneeling. It's okay now. But the boy flinched at his voice, retreating as far as the chain would let him. His eyes darted not to Mason but to Blitz. That's when it happened. Blitz sat. Quiet. Still. Then he inched closer, crouching low, tail down, muzzle soft. Kai blinked. A beat passed. Then another. And then, as if breaking through glass, Kai whispered, hoarse and cracked, "Blitz?" Mason's chest tightened. The chain clanked as the boy inched forward. One tiny hand reached through the bars. Blitz leaned in and licked the dirt from his wrist, then nudged his nose against the small, bony fingers. A tremble passed through the boy's whole frame. But he didn't pull away. Mason turned back. "I need cutters, now!" A teammate tossed them from the left wing. The chain broke. The cage opened. Mason lifted Kai gently, so light, like lifting a memory, and placed him carefully into the carrier's arms. Blitz flanked them, pressing his body close, always watching, always guarding. Gunfire flared again behind them, the back door. Mason turned. "Go! Take him! Blitz, with me!" But Blitz didn't move. His eyes flicked toward Kai, then Mason, then back to Kai. And then Blitz stepped forward and rubbed his muzzle against Kai's Lagone last sweep of scent, like signing his promise. "Go, I'll cover you." Mason nodded once. "We'll be waiting." Then Blitz turned, back into the fray. He moved like memory itself, silent, fast, and precise. The dogs of war never forgot their purpose. He found the auctioneer, last the man in the porcelain mask, still trying to upload files as the warehouse burned with sirens. Blitz tackled him from the side, shattering his knee with a twist. The mask cracked in two as he screamed. Sirens. Shouting. The sound of children crying this time. Not in fear, but release. Outside, Mason waited in the alley beside the transport van. His hands trembled as he reached inside and gently touched Kai's forehead. The boy didn't wake, but his breath came steady. Lila sat beside him, rocking slowly, her eyes wide, full of something too big for her age. And beside the van, coated in sweat and blood and ash, Blitz emerged. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He simply walked, slow, deliberate, toward Mason, then toward the van. Lila opened the door. Blitz jumped in and lay beside Karasting, his head across the boy's ankles like an oath. Their tails touched, just barely, but it was enough, a silent recognition between warriors. The headlines came fast and loud. Midnight raid busts, massive trafficking ring, dozens of children rescued in joint operation. Anonymous tip leads to warehouse horror. News anchors in polished suits read with practiced outrage, their delivery sharp and sanitized. No names, no scars, no dogs. But in the living room of the safe house, the television was muted. Mason sat watching the images flash. Crime scene tape, agents leading shell-shocked children into the lightened, in one blurred frame, a dog, Blitz, uncredited, unmentioned. Lila sat curled on the couch, hoodie sleeves swallowed in her fists. She wasn't watching the news. Her eyes were on Kai, lying close to Blitz on the rug, still too thin, still flinching at sound, but alive. His new collar was black nylon, with a silver tag Mason had chosen himself. KAI. You are not property. You are family. Lila had cried when she read it. Quiet tears. Salt. Without sound. Mason's phone buzzed. A text. Press wants a statement. 5 minutes. Keep it clean. Clean. As if the truth needed scrubbing. As if dogs didn't bleed. As if girls like Lila hadn't been locked in cages and branded like inventory. Blitz watched him rise. Their eyes met. A silent exchange. Do what you must, but don't erase what matters. The interview happened on the steps of a generic brick building. The reporter was polished, her questions prepared. Yes, the children are safe. Yes, multiple agencies were involved. It was routine until she asked, what led to the breakthrough? Mason hesitated. He could have cited surveillance, informants, but instead, there was a dog, retired canine named Blitz. When our systems failed, he didn't. He found the children. He kept a little girl from falling apart when no one else could. The reporter blinked. Someone off camera gestured to Rapp. One last question. Do you believe justice has been served? Mason looked into the lens. Justice isn't a press release. It's remembering the kids were never supposed to be there. It's honoring the ones who saved them even if they don't wear badges or speak. The network cut most of the footage, but a bystander's phone caught it. The clip spread. Mason's last words. Blitz's shadow behind him. Lila's voice off-screen, gently calling Kai. Online, someone wrote, "They didn't need the whole truth, just enough to recognize the shape of it." That night, Lila entered the kitchen. "Did it help?" she asked. "Saying something?" Mason handed her a mug of chamomile. "I don't know, but it's a start." On the porch, Blitz and Kai sat side by side, silent guardians under the night sky. The morning after the raid was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just the soft scent of oatmeal, gauze, and fur left in sunlight. Lila sat on the floor near the back door, knees drawn up, hoodie tags still attached. Her silence was heavier than usual. Kai lay curled across her feet. His ribs showed less now. The embedded collar had been clipped away. He hadn't made a sound knot even when it was cut free. He just looked at Mason, pressed his nose gently to Lila's hand. Now he was a tether. Not of chains, of memory. Blitz stayed close, but gave them space, his body angled protectively toward them. From the doorway, Mason stood watching, mug in hand, heart in throat. Then, Lila hummed a broken melody from somewhere deep. She reached out and touched Kai's ear. He looked up, and for the first time, his tail thumped. Not joy, just recognition. "I didn't forget you," she whispered. Her first words since before the raid. Blitz approached slowly, ears low, posture deferent. He placed himself beside Kai. Lila reached toward him. "Blitz," she said. He nudged her gently with his snout. She giggled. Fragile and strange, like light breaking through water. She leaned back, hands resting on both dogs. Her fingers moved through their fur like she was rediscovering the feel of safety. Later, a therapist arrived. Lila said nothing to her, only whispered once, "Blitz understands." That night, when asked where she wanted to sleep, she clung to Blitz's neck. So they made a bed on the floor. Lila lay between the two dogs, whispering stories to them in broken phrases. A swing, a blue dress, the day they took Kai away. Blitz didn't move. He stayed. Kai, still healing, stayed too. Mason peeked in before bed. Moonlight grazed Lila's cheek. There was the beginning of a smile. Not healed, but beginning. She whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Weeks later, under a drizzle-gray sky, Mason stood outside the courthouse, holding a document. One signature was his. The other, small and careful, was Lila's Prasgrist. She sat nearby, bundled in her hoodie, sipping cocoa, Blitz at her feet, Kai beside him. "They said it's done," Mason said. "Judge signed it. You live with me now if you still want that." She didn't answer at first. "You drink too much coffee," she said. He blinked. "You talk to Blitz like he's a person. He's smarter than most people I know." She looked up, not with fear, but with something older. "Then, I guess it's okay. I want to stay." Mason felt something shift inside him, something like peace. She reached down to Blitz. "Can I give him a new name?" "A new name?" "Not instead. Just also, like a nickname. What do you have in mind?" She smiled, just barely. "Hope, for what he gave me. That night, and all the ones after." "Blitz and Hope," Mason murmured. "Same dog," Lila said. "Just different parts of the story." Blitz gave a small huff, as if agreeing. That night, there were no celebrations, just tea, a sketchbook, a warm fireplace. Lila drew dogs, some like Kai, some like Blitz, some unnamed. She whispered something to Blitz. He rose, padded to the cabinet, and retrieved her blanket. "You trained him to do that?" she asked. "No," Mason said. "He trained himself." She looked up. "I think he likes Hope better. He'll come when you call. That's the kind of dog he is." She nodded, then added softly, "He's not the only one." Mason sat beside her. "Whatever name you carry, Lila, this is home now." Blitz curled at their feet, breathing steady, watching. Some weeks later, Mason and Blitz stood among gravesome with names, some marked only unknown. Mason knelt by one. Aria, 2017, 2023. He left a tag behind. You're not a number anymore. He looked at the field. I thought this would feel like justice, but it doesn't. We stopped one cage. That's not the same as saving everyone. Blitz sat beside him, quiet and firm. Mason opened his weathered notebook, wrote 5 words. No more cages, not ever. He stood. They deserve more than flowers. They deserve change. Blitz lifted a paw to Mason's hand. Not a trick, not command, just truth. They stayed like that as the sun dipped. A man and his partner. Not for headlines, not for glory. Just to remember. And to keep going. Because some missions are too sacred to abandon. And some promises like the kind whispered in twilight by a child to a dog named Hopier too important to break. The room was quiet, but not empty. Sunlight streamed through a dusty window pane, striping the linoleum floor. Mismatched chairs lined the wall, some too large for the children, others worn soft from use. In the center sat a child-sized table, scattered with untouched coloring books. Near it lay 2 dogs. Blitz, older and composed, watched the door and window with calm readiness. His once scarred coat had softened. He wore no vest here. He didn't need one. Beside him, younger and leaner, was Kai. The pup's ears twitched at hallway noises, but he didn't rise. He had learned not every sound meant danger not here. He had learned this through Blitz, not through commands, but presence. Blitz let Kai eat first, curled around him during nightmares, nuzzled the boy's hand when he screamed in his sleep. Trust. Blitz taught. Didn't need words. Their first child was Ella, 7, a scar behind her ear from a tracking implant. She hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not to anyone. She entered holding a crumpled red crayon like a weapon. Blitz blinked. Kai watched her, head tilted not out of confusion, but recognition. Ella froze. The crayon dropped. Kai crawled forward on his belly and lay at her feet. He didn't touch her, didn't beg. He waited. 12 minutes passed. Then, quietly, her hand came to rest on his head. Blitz exhaled. The room breathed with him. That became their rhythm. Not every session was soft. Some children screamed, threw chairs, or collapsed into silence so deep it ached. But Blitz and Kai didn't flinch. They waited. They adapted. They became the heartbeat of the room. One boy, Lucas, rejected everyone, even the therapy dog assigned to him. But he didn't mind stillness. One day, Blitz entered the room and did nothing. He simply sat. Lucas stared. 3 sessions passed like that. Then one afternoon, Blitz crossed the room not to Lucas, but to the corner wall and lay down facing away. Lucas lay beside him. He doesn't want to be seen, the therapist whispered. No, said Mason, watching from the window. But he wants to know he's not alone. Blitz understood. So did Kai. Lila gave it a name. She had begun whispering again, not often, and never when adults were listening. But when she sat alone with the dogs, she'd murmur things, fears, names, fractured memories. One day, braiding a frayed ribbon into Kai's collar, she said, I used to think silence meant no one cared, but now I think it's what guardians do. When you're too hurt for words. Kai rested his head on her lap. Blitz, across the room, lifted his gaze. Someone was coming. The dogs weren't props. They were survivors. Not trained for tricks, but chosen for knowing what it felt like to be used, broken, and still choose to guard. That night, after the last child left, Blitz and Kai walked the hallway side by side. No leashes, just 2 shadows. On the wall near the exit was a mural, a field, a broken fence, 2 silhouettes sewn large, one small facing an open sky. Beneath it, scrawled in backward letters, they stayed when others ran. Blitz looked once, then turned away. Guardians don't need thanks. The next morning was ordinary. Sunlight poured through cracked blinds. The radiator hummed softly. But in that ordinary light, something extraordinary happened. Lila laughed. Not a polite exhale. Not a smile. A real laugh, pure, surprised, whole. Mason, mid-coffee pour, froze. He looked up to see her sitting cross-legged beside the dogs. Kai had sneezed mid-lick and bumped her face. Lila giggled, holding her stomach, laughing like the rules of sorrow had forgotten her for a second. Blitz rested his chin on her knee. Kai licked her ear again, sheepishly. Mason didn't move. He just watched. It had been 6 months since the raid that brought Lila to them. She spoke sometimes mostly to the dogs. But this laugh, it was something else. Later, on the porch, Mason sipped tea and watched her play in the yard. Blitz sat beside him, ears forward, body calm. The dogs mirrored each other's silent sentries. "She's coming back," Mason whispered. Blitz nudged his elbow with his nose. Irene, the center's director, stepped beside him. "I heard her laugh," she said softly. "She started drawing again. Dogs mostly. And one she won't name." "What does it look like?" Mason asked. "Like Blitz, but not quite. Scarred leg, big ears. Maybe a memory." He nodded. "Some kids draw what they can't say." Later, Lila approached the porch, holding a drawing. It showed the yard, the porch, the dogs, Mason. But in the shadows behind them were 2 faceless figures. Lila pointed. "Those are the ones we haven't saved yet." Mason swallowed. "We will," he promised. She looked him in the eye and nodded. That night, Blitz slept by her door. Not from duty, from belonging. The next morning came with a gentle mist, like the sky was exhaling. Outside the courthouse, Mason held a folded document. His name was there, and beside it, scribbled in small, careful letters, Lila's. She sat quietly on a bench, bundled in a hoodie. Blitz lay at her feet, unmoving. "They said it's done," Mason said. "Judge signed it. If you still want to live with me." Lila didn't look up. Then, "You drink too much coffee," she muttered. He blinked, then smiled. "You always let Blitz on the couch," she added, "and talk to him like a person. He's smarter than most people I know." She looked at him, really looked. "Then, I guess it's okay. I want to stay." Mason's chest ached with something like peace. "I was thinking," Lila began. "Can I give him a new name?" Mason tilted his head. "A new name?" "Not instead, just also. Like a nickname." Blitz shifted, leaning against her leg. "What'd you have in mind?" She smiled barely. "Hope for what he gave me." Mason's throat tightened. "Blitz and Hope," he whispered. "Same dog," she said. "Just different parts of the story." That night the house was quiet. No balloons, no fanfare. Just Lila sketching on the couch, Mason sipping tea by the window, Blitz by the fire, Kai nearby, dozing. Lila reached down, whispered something to Blitz. He got up, opened the cabinet, and pulled out her blanket. "You train him to do that?" she asked. "No," Mason said. "He trains himself." She looked up. "I think he likes Hope better." "Maybe, but he'll always come when you call." She nodded, then whispered, almost too quiet to catch. "He's not the only one." Mason didn't ask. He just sat beside her. "Whatever name you carry, Lila," he said, "this is home now. For all of us." Blitz curled at their feet, his breathing steady. And in the firelight's flicker, as shadows danced on walls worn with time, the world didn't change all at once. But it healed slowly, gently, like breath returning to a room that had forgotten how to breathe. And at its center stood a German shepherdess trained for war, now called Hope-Keeping Watch, in the silence. The morning came gently, wrapped in a hush only winter knows how to keep. The frost on the windows caught the soft light of dawn, painting the world in silver hushes. Inside the small cabin, everything was still. Blitz didn't rise. Not when the kettle whistled, not when the birds began their slow chorus, not when footsteps padded across the wooden floor, the same steps that had once made his ears perk, tail thump. Lila noticed first. She'd grown now no longer. The small, hollow-eyed child Blitz had rescued from a place too dark for memory to hold. She was 16, hair longer, voice stronger. But there were still nights she couldn't sleep unless Blitz's steady breathing filled the quiet. Still mornings she began not with words, but with her hand resting gently on his fur. She knelt beside him, fingers trembling as they hovered over his ribs. "Blitz," she whispered. And the sound was a breath more than a word. His eyes opened. Slow, gentle. A flicker of recognition glinted in the amber, dulled only slightly by age. He tried to raise his head. Failed. But his tail thumped once. It was enough. Lila folded to the ground beside him, her knees pressed into the old quilt he'd claimed years ago. She didn't call for Mason, Not yet. This was their moment. "You found me," she said, brushing her fingers through the gray in his coat. "You found me when I was gone." Her voice broke. Blitz blinked slowly, as if trying to reach through her sorrow with that same silent strength he'd always had. The kind that said, "I'm here. I never stopped being here." Lila pressed her forehead to his. "You never let go." Outside, the snow began to fall. Mason stood in the doorway, one hand against the frame, heart cracking like old timber. He'd known it was close. The vet had warned them a heart murmur, slowing lungs, the stiffness in Blitz's joints. But Blitz had held on, through storms, through nightmares, through everything. And now, as the world softened with snow, the old dog was letting go. He walked over slowly, Saturday beside them, said nothing. Because what do you say to a soul who never asked for thanks, who carried the worst of the world on his back and never once faltered? Lila turned her face toward him. "He's tired, Mason." Mason nodded. "He's earned his rest." She looked back down. "But I don't want him to go." Blitz shifted, barely. His nose touched her hand. Once, then fell still. And in that moment, Mason swore he saw something pass between them, something deeper than goodbye. Something that belonged only to those who had walked through fire together and come out the other side holding each other's hearts. Blitz exhaled. Long, soft, a sigh that sounded like peace. Then silence. No gasp, no final twitch. Just stillness. Lila didn't move, didn't cry. Not at first. She curled beside him, arms wrapping his frame as if to keep him here through sheer will. And for a time, the room held only the sound of her breathing too fast, too shallow, like someone holding off the tide. Then her voice broke the quiet. "You can rest now," she whispered. "You don't have to guard me anymore." And that's when the tears came. Not loud, not wild, but the kind that come from the center of a heart. The kind you don't cry for just a dog, but for everything he carried for you. Mason placed a hand on Blitz's head. "Let it rest there a moment." "Thank you," he said simply. They buried him under the old oak, near the field where he and Kai had first run side by side like shadows chasing light. Lila chose the spot. She planted wildflowers above the grave bluebells, his favorite, the kind he used to bury his nose in on long walks. There was no eulogy, no ceremony, just Mason, Lila, and Kai. Now Silver muzzled himself, standing beside them, and a collar, worn, faded, placed at the foot of the stone they carved by hand. It read, "Blitz, Guardian, Brother, Hope, you found her. You never let go." That night, the house felt larger. Lila lay awake, fingers pressed to the old blanket Blitz had once claimed. She didn't cry again. Not yet. Grief, she had learned, comes in waves not thunderous, but quiet and certain, like tides returning to a familiar shore. Kai padded in and laid beside her. She turned toward him, whispered, "Did you know he waited for today?" Kai didn't answer, just rested his head against hers. And in that stillness, Lila realized something she couldn't yet say aloud. Blitz hadn't left. Not really. He was in the silence that no longer frightened her. In the steps she took on her own. In the laughter she had rediscovered. In every child she now comforted beside Kai. He had never let go. And neither would she. The morning was still when they carried him. No breeze stirred the leaves. No birds dared to sing. The sky above Granite Hollow muted itself to a soft, respectful gray, as if even nature understood what had been lost. Blitz lay wrapped in a woolen blanket, the color of pine as hold, worn, familiar. It had once lined the back seat of Mason's truck, soaked in years of fur and forest. Now, it served as the last thing to touch Blitz's body before the earth did. They buried him beneath the old oak. The same one. The place where years ago, Blitz had pushed his way through bramble and bone-chill fog to find a girl with a voice stolen by horror and eyes that had seen too much. Lila? Now she stood taller, no longer a child, but not quite grown. Her arms wrapped around herself, sleeves pulled down past her hands like they used to when she was scared. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She was remembering. Kai sat beside her, silent, his eyes a little more weathered, more understanding than any dog his age should be, watched the burial like he understood. Maybe he did. Mason lowered Blitz into the earth himself. No shovel handed off. No task delegated. His palms pressed to the wooden box, as if still hoping to feel warmth through the grain. His breath came shallow, drawn in tight, like the air itself felt too heavy to carry. Lila stepped forward. In her hands, a wooden plaque. She had carved it herself, one shaky line at a time, over 3 long nights by the fireplace. No flowers, no marble, just truth. He didn't speak, but he saved lives. She placed it at the head of the grave, the wood sinking slightly into the moss-covered soil, like it belonged there all along. Mason reached into his coat pocket. The dog tag Blitz's chimed gently as he pulled it out. A thin chain, a scratched tag. The letters worn but still legible. Blitz, K9 Unit 912. No one left behind. Mason knelt beside Kai. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the younger shepherdun paw forward, ears slightly tipped back, gaze flicking between Mason and the grave. Then Mason slipped the tag over Kai's neck. The metal brushed fur and settled against the dog's chest like a torch passed from one soldier to the next. Kai didn't move. He just exhaled a long, slow breath and rested his head against Mason's knee. Lila sat down beside them. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. Her hand found Kai's fur and curled gently into it. She didn't cry anymore. Not because it didn't hurt, but because Blitz had already taught her what to do with pain. You carry it. You keep moving. You don't let it silence love. Later, when the guests had gone, the therapists, the local handlers, even the mayor who had stopped by to pay his respects, Mason, Lila, and Kai remained. The sun had started to cut through the gray streaks of light breaking across the clearing like quiet promises. Lila traced the carved letters on the plaque with her fingers. "You know what I remember most?" she asked softly, not looking up. Mason didn't answer. He knew better. The question wasn't a request, it was a doorway she was walking through. "It wasn't the day Blitz found me," she said. "It was after, when I couldn't talk, not even to you." She gave a soft, half smile. "But I talked to him. I told him everything in my head, and he never left." She looked at the grave now, not with despair, but with gratitude. "That's what I want to be." Mason turned toward her. "What do you mean?" She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded pamphlet. The logo of a veterinary academy in Montana rested in the corner. Her name was printed at the top. Accepted. "I want to be the kind of person that listens," she said. "That protects. That doesn't walk away when it gets hard." Mason swallowed, his eyes lingering on her face longer than he meant to. "You already are," he said. Kai gave a soft woof, as if in agreement. They stayed there until dusk. The shadows grew long, reaching across the roots of the oak like the stretch of old stories. Kai circled once, then curled beside the grave, his body pressed close, as if guarding it, not from harm, from forgetting. Lila watched him, her voice barely above the breeze. "Blitz didn't just save me," she whispered. "He made sure I'd never be alone again." Mason placed a hand on her shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "He made sure none of us would." And in that silence, where no sirens rang and no reporters reached, a legacy was sealed. Not in statues, not in parades, but in the quiet thump of a tail, the soft breath of a child, finally safe, and the unmarked paths where paw prints led the way. The rain hadn't let up all evening. It came down in quiet sheets, soaking the porch rails and pooling in the driveway of the small farmhouse on the edge of town, the one with the crooked mailbox and the wind chime made of rusted keys. Inside, the house was warm. A kettle hissed softly on the stove. A pair of boots sat drying by the door. And on the couch, Lila sat with Kai curled up at her feet, his eyes half closed, ears twitching at distant sounds only he could hear. The call came just past midnight. Mason answered it, his voice low and steady as always. Lila didn't need to hear the words. She could tell by the way he stood straighter, the crease that appeared between his brows, the way his hand slid into the pocket where he kept the folded names of children they hadn't yet found. When he hung up, Mason turned, but Lila was already standing. Her coat was in her hands. Kai had lifted his head. His ears were up now, alert. No words had been spoken, but everyone in that room understood. "A boy," Mason said quietly. "Found out near Old Pine Hollow. Wet, not talking." Lila nodded. Her voice was calm, certain. "Let's go." Kai was already at the door before she finished the sentence. She didn't need to ask if he remembered. Didn't need to wonder if he felt it, because dogs like Kai didn't just respond to commands. They responded to grief, to loneliness, to the smallest tremor of pain in the air. And this wasn't the first time. Not since Blitz. Blitz had trained him not just with obedience, but with silence, with presence, with that steady, immovable kind of comfort that didn't demand anything in return. Now, it was Kai's turn to become that for someone else. The old truck rumbled down the road, headlights cutting through sheets of rain like weak flashlights through a dream. Mason drove. Lila sat in the passenger seat, one hand on Kai's back. She didn't speak, just watched the rain trail across the glass and listened to the windshield wipers groan in rhythm with her heartbeat. She thought of Blitz, of his last breath, of the way his tail had thumped twice when she whispered, "You never let go." His grave beneath the oak was still fresh in her mind, no matter how many days passed. And yet there was no bitterness in her now. Just this steady throb of remembrance that didn't ache anymore warmed. They reached the scene just as the deputy was wrapping a blanket around the boy. He couldn't have been more than 8, hair plastered to his face, bare feet muddy and blue. His small chest heaved in hiccuped breaths. But he wasn't crying anymore. He was just staring. Frozen. Gone somewhere inside. Lila didn't approach right away. She let Kai go first. The shepherd moved like a shadow quiet, low to the ground, eyes soft. He stopped 3 feet from the boy. Saturday. Waited. No bark, no movement. Just presence. Stillness, like an old tree standing guard. The boy looked at him, blinked. Kai tilted his head slightly. Then slowly he lowered himself to the wet grass, stretched his neck forward, and inched just close enough for his nose to touch the edge of the blanket. The boy didn't move. But after a long moment, his tiny hand crept forward trembling and rested lightly on Kai's head. Not a pet, just contact, just anchor. Lila knelt beside them then, her own movements mirroring the dog's. Soft. No sudden shifts. She met the boy's eyes and offered a quiet smile. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "He hears just fine." Kai closed his eyes beneath the boy's touch. There were no miracle words, no magic, just the quiet that came when someone finally felt. Found. When silence didn't mean being alone. And in that field, beneath the falling rain, another story began out with a rescue, but with a hand resting on fur and a breath that didn't need to be chased. Later, after the boy was warm in the back seat, sipping cocoa from a thermos Lila always kept ready, Mason turned to her. "You did good." Lila shook her head. "Kai did." Mason looked at the dog, now curled beside the boy, his body curved just enough to shield without trapping. Blitz would be proud. Lila didn't answer for a moment. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the worn, scratched tag Blitz had worn on his collar. She'd kept it ever since the day Mason passed it to her, after the oak tree. After the last goodbye, she ran her thumb across the engraving. It was almost too faint now. Blitz K9037, vertical bar protect, heal, find. She looked at Kai. "I think it's time," she whispered. She reached forward and gently clipped the tag to Kai's collar, just beneath his own. It clinked softly against the metal ring, like a promise carried forward. "Come on, partner," she said, her voice low but clear. Kai lifted his head. She opened the door. The rain was still falling, but lighter now, like a hush, a benediction. "Let's go find someone else." Kai leapt down, landing in the wet grass with a practiced ease, already scanning the tree line. And just like that, another chapter began. Another cry in the night. Another dog who would not stop until every child was seen, held, found. Not because they were trained to, but because someone, long ago, had laid beneath an oak tree and refused to let go. Some stories stay with us not because they were loud, but because they were loyal. Like Blitz. Like Kai. Like every German shepherd who ever stood between a child and the dark. There's a quiet kind of love that animals give us. It doesn't ask for much, just to be seen, just to be kept close. And in return, they carry parts of us we didn't know needed saving. Blitz didn't need words to teach us that. His silence was enough. His presence, everything. If you've got a dog curled at your feet, or a memory that still warms your chest, maybe take a moment today to thank them. Sit a little longer. Watch how they breathe when they're safe. And if you've ever wondered how to deepen that bond of in just a little, I've come across something gentle and thoughtful that might help. It's not a flashy program, just a quiet guide, like a friend walking beside you. You can look into it if your heart says so. Sometimes, healing starts with a paw on your knee. And sometimes, the next story begins with you.